Well, thank you, Amherst Media, and thank you, everybody, for your patience. We were a little delayed due to technological problems, but with that, I'm going to call this meeting to order at 6:10 p.m., Amherst School Committee. And just a reminder, this meeting is recorded, and is it actually being live broadcast right now? So it's just being recorded. Okay, so it's being recorded by Amherst Media. So welcome back, everyone. This is the first meeting of the new school year, so I hope it was a productive and good summer for everybody. It's nice to be back in the old haunts. So with that, we're already a few minutes delayed, so we're in good form this meeting as usual. Let's move on to the first order of business, which is to approve minutes of June 18th, July 10th, and July 27th. We had a couple of short meetings over the summer break, and so that's where all of these meeting minutes have come up. So I will take a motion from anyone before we move into discussion and review.
Move to approve the minutes of June 18th, 2018.
Second.
Yes?
Just one note on item 6. I know I was probably anxious to get out of there, but I probably didn't both move to and second the adjournment. I don't honestly remember which one it was. So.
Wow.
Yeah, there is a
That is impressive.
Yes. And I don't remember. I think we have to look back at the video and see if that mystery can be solved. Any other minutes corrections or edits? Okay. All those in favor to approve the minutes with the change to come, please raise your hand and signify aye. Okay, unanimously approved. Thank you. And I will take a motion for the next set of minutes. Mr. Nakajima.
I move to approve the minutes of July 10th, 2018.
Okay, do I have a second?
Second.
Thank you. Any questions, comments? Corrections? Okay, all those in favor? Thank you, unanimous. And then finally, Mr. Nakajima.
I move to approve the minutes of July 27th, 2018.
Do I have a second?
Second.
Thank you. Any corrections, comments, questions? Okay. All those in favor to approve the minutes? Thank you very much. It is unanimous. Okay. With that, we are moving into announcements and public comments. So we'll take announcements first from the committee. Mr. Dunley?
So a couple. One is, and they're both related to sort of advocacy. One is that the local charter school, which has been proposing to be expanded for the last few years, has been denied by the state, has again proposed an expansion. To state the obvious, this is something I'm opposed to, and I expect our committee will take it up at some point. And if the public is interested in providing their input, they can do it at least until November 1st. We'll have a firmer deadline provided by the state next month, is when they said they would get that to us. Easiest way is by email, which is charterschools@doe.mass.edu. You can also just sort of Google that in case you missed it on the record. So yeah, I hope we advocate on that. I also hope that we make an effort to engage the public and other town officials on this. Spending last fiscal year $1.5 million at our level, and I think it was $1.5 million at the region, is obviously a major hit to a town's budget. And right now, I think it's kind of an opportunity to raise public awareness about this issue as it impacts school budgets, given the transition in our town government. There's a very healthy discussion going on right now about how to manage the future of our town's revenues, and this is a big factor in it. So I look forward to a broader community discussion and engagement on this. And the second announcement is also related to advocacy and school funding. So I participated in a conference call with MAJA, the Mass Ed Justice Alliance. So they're a statewide progressive advocacy group. They were involved in the Question 2 2016 against the charter schools. They've been heavily involved in trying to get the recommendations of the Foundation Budget Review Commission passed. And the little snippet there is that there was a recent very robust study that underscored and reiterated the conclusions of the Foundation Budget. The public schools in Massachusetts are underfunded by $2.6 billion. And at the end of this fiscal year at the state, there was a proposal to implement some of the recommendations partway. It wouldn't have been nearly as what was needed, but would have been something, and that failed. And so the general sort of summary that I got from MAJA at the end is that we're sort of done, very impatient with the state process, and so kind of like what happened in 2016 with the charter school opposition, where that was organized and involved organizations like the MTA, like MASC, Mass Association of School Committees, and MAJA. I expect there to be a similar level of advocacy that could come to our committee, sooner rather than later. So I look forward to that and to raising public awareness about that as well.
Great, thank you, Mr. Demling. Any other announcements from the committee? Okay. We'll move on to public comment. So just a reminder, if the public has any comments that you would like to make, please come up to the front to the microphone, state your name for the record, and you have 3 minutes.
Hi, I'm Tony Cunningham. I've been following with interest the many positive developments happening in our elementary schools over the past few months, and I wanted to commend you all for your work. Good progress is being made on the dual language program and the complicated puzzle of how to do enrollment for it. There seems to be great excitement in the community about it, and I think it will be a real boon for the town. The Fort River Feasibility Study has hired a design firm that has experience renovating open classroom schools and building to net zero energy standards, and they're starting work on the Fort River building program and the study timeline. 2 new boilers have been installed in Wildwood, and I believe the teachers get back into their classrooms tomorrow. Get access. And we have the encouraging results of the air quality testing at Wildwood and Fort River that thankfully show no areas of concern. And I trust the superintendent and the committee will advertise the results broadly and to put at ease any concerns held by community members. In addition to all of this good stuff, there are potential signs that our school's enrollment decline may possibly be turning a corner. There are a number of new housing developments in the pipeline. The dual language program will likely help to retain families in district that would otherwise choose the Chinese immersion charter school. And UMass continues to grow their graduate school, a demographic that brought almost 50 children to Amherst elementary schools last year. Perhaps the first sign of this is a spike in kindergarten enrollment, up from 122 last year to 155 this year so far. And my younger daughter will be one of them. It's an exciting time for our schools, and I've been impressed with your combined abilities to keep on top of so many important initiatives, and I'm optimistic that Amherst Elementary Schools will continue to thrive. Thank you.
Any other comments from the public? Okay. Sure, Dr. Morris, you want to move into the superintendent's update?
Sure, I'll be brief. So I'll pick up where Ms. Cunningham left off about Wildwood. So Mr. McPherson will fill in as part of the air quality a little bit of the summary of the work that's been completed, but the building will be open tomorrow. Not everything's going to be like, it takes a while for the chillers to get going. Like, it's not going to be probably the most comfortable day for Mr. Yaffe, but he'll be with me most of the day in air conditioning, so that'll be fine. But the work was completed, and we're on the exact schedule that we set for the school in terms of when the school could be back open and the staff would have access to be back in the building. So thank you to Mr. McPherson and his team for a tremendous amount of work at both the elementary and secondary, but as an elementary meeting, I'll stick to the elementary. I'll be giving some of the updates and some of the agenda items. That's why this particular update is quite brief. I just want to look forward a little bit, which is that The next 3 days are administrative training days, and so we do some team building. We do have some new people on our team, both at the building level and central office, food service. We'll be doing some work on implicit bias, significant amount of work on kind of discipline and how to approach that. I'll do a little more at our next meeting after it's happened. But those are the next 3 mornings. That's what I was referencing with Mr. Yaffe. Looking ahead a little further, our new teachers come on the 23rd, which is a week from Thursday, which is soon, which is great to welcome excited folks and talented individuals who've been hired by our leadership team to be joining our district. So all of our leadership team actually participates in the beginning, and then Mr. Sheehan is pretty central in the rest of that morning, and the Teacher Association actually takes a large role in the afternoon, which is great collaboration with Ms. Fay and the APEA. A little beyond that, we get to see Tuesday, I think it's the 28th, is Convocation, which you're all invited to. It's 8 o'clock in the morning at the high school library. It generally is since I've started, I try to do short and sweet as a big theme, and I don't want to minimize the work that goes into it, but it's not an all-morning affair the way it is, perhaps in some larger districts. But you're all welcome. My goal is always getting people out by 9:30 if I think people are thinking of their schedules and what they need to be doing. And I haven't talked to the regional chair, and it's an elementary meeting, but there is a statement from historically, it's been from the regional school committee chair as well, on behalf of the school committees. That afternoon or evening is first day activities in the town common at 5 o'clock. Another thing that's fun and a little festive in a similar way, just with children instead of adults, the way Convocation is. We'll cross our fingers for good weather. So far, the last couple of years, we've had very good weather for that. But Sam the Minuteman will be there. Lots of fun things for children, families, and town officials as well. I know the town manager's come the last couple of years, and he's planning on coming again to that. The following day is that Wednesday, the 29th, is the first day of school for students in grades 1 through 6. Our kindergarten and preschoolers have orientations and small group meetings those first couple days, and they don't start till Tuesday, the 4th of September is the first day for kindergarten and preschool. I think it's worth noting, because we've talked about it here, that's also an election day. And we have worked, particularly at Crocker Farm, with our police department, at the other schools more at a building-based level, to make sure that our processes and protocols make sure that our youngest students' first day of the school year is a positive, productive one and not distracted by town elections. And the police is supporting us, not just with the officer like last year, but actually with some traffic control at key moments in the morning and drop off and pick up. Just that was one of the pieces of feedback we learned last year, is the inside we felt really good about, and the outside, no matter how many stakes you put up that say voter only, that doesn't always resolve the problem in terms of the traffic flow in front of the school. So we'll have additional support at Crocker Farm for that.
Mike, I'm sorry to interrupt, but just a quick question related to something that you mentioned before. So because it's the first day of school for new families or new students potentially, I'm wondering if there's been any communication that's gone out just to let them know that that's election day and that that's going to be potentially just to be aware of,
Yeah, and that's happening at the school level, because all those families and students will be in the couple days prior for orientation. So we figured, instead of yet another email, doing it in person, letting people know, because they may have questions, and providing more two-way communication was the approach we chose to take. Yeah.
Thank you.
And I think that's it, unless there's other questions, because a lot of the other updates that I would give are in the agenda topics.
Yeah. Mr. Demling?
Is Principal Shea feeling okay about the plan for the 4th? It's just, normally an election day is challenging, but being the first day for really young kids.
So if he could redesign the election schedule, he would. But I think it's fair to say that he feels supported in terms of the plan moving forward and the level of adult presence from the town to support a smooth running of the school day. Yeah. But if you asked him, could you move the election to the 5th, it would be a quick response from Mr. Shea.
Okay, great. Thank you, Dr. Morris. Really appreciate that update, and looking forward to following up after the things that you just mentioned. Okay, so the next order of business is the Wildwood Fort River Air Quality Testing Report. So just a brief preface, the committee was advised that these tests were going to be conducted in the spring of 2018. and that the reports would be reviewed at the next possible school committee meeting, which is this one. And so I know that the committee and the community appreciate hearing the results of these tests. I know I do. You know, it's obviously critical for the safety, the health, and well-being of our students and our educators and building staff that these buildings are found to be capable of contributing to a positive educational environment. We've had a lot of robust conversations around that here, and a lot of concern expressed by community members and others to make sure that that's the case. I think these reports, you know, point out a few problems, obviously, you know, not major ones, you know, some minor problems. And I expect that Mr. McPherson and Dr. Morris are going to review those in detail today. But the reports also lay a lot of those concerns to rest that we've discussed before. The bottom line is that, you know, I think that a lot of the work that the district has done in recent years to remove carpeting, for example, that was holding a lot of the mold, you know, repairing roofs and replacing ceiling tiles, all those kinds of things have helped mitigate a lot of those problems that have experienced in the past. We do know from previous years' reports that were not as glowing as this one that there have been issues. And so, you know, when the community and educators and others have mentioned those problems, that there are reasons for the mention of those problems. The other last thing that I just want to say is that, you know, these buildings are getting older. And while we're obviously, you know, working very hard to keep those problems at bay, that these buildings are still proving challenging in terms of serving as healthy learning environments. And so it's something that, you know, I just want to make sure that the superintendent and the committee are kind of keeping front of mind, is that there is a lot of work that still needs to be done in order to ensure that these are the best, you know, educational environments that they can be. So anyway, I just wanted to preface that because those were things that I was thinking when I was reading the report, and these are pretty long reports. I mean, this is close to 200 pages of reports, lots of pictures and, you know, and a lot of data and things like that that I'm not going to pretend I completely understand, but it was helpful to see and to be able to reference. And so anyway, I want to just turn it over to Dr. Morris. I'm not sure if you're going to be leading this discussion or if Mr. McPherson, I see him in the audience. But
Yeah, I'll do I'll add on to your intro and then introduce Mr. McPherson to describe in more detail. So you captured a lot of what I was going to say, and we didn't talk about this, it's just going to happen that way, which is to say we're pleased with the results in terms of the concerns we've heard over the years and what the results tell us, and that they're, you know, some of the concerns weren't realized in the reports. And the reports were about environmental health, and they weren't about teaching and learning. So I'm going to turn it over to Mr. McPherson in a minute, because he can much better describe the health and environmental piece. The rooms still don't have walls. So I want to just, I don't want to lose that in this conversation, that there's still significant work. I'm glad there's a Fort River feasibility study. Like, yeah, I don't want anyone to have the perception that that's not a worthwhile thing that volunteers are putting lots of time and energy into. So I want to get the right messaging, which is that, you know, and Mr. McPherson will describe it in more detail about the environmental health, and to note that these are still not buildings that are perfect learning environments for children. So I think it's just having that balance is important to state, because I don't want to overvalue one and undermine the other. You know, they're both important. With that, I'll turn it to Mr. McPherson to describe a bit of what we found and what we're doing.
Certainly. So as you mentioned, we have reports for both schools. They are essentially identical. The airborne concerns are non-existent, and particularly the bad actors, carbon monoxide, the asbestos, radon, which I actually had a concern about, all panned out to be near zero. It's non-detectable in some instances. So the difficulties that we are encountering are the mechanical units are cluttered with vast materials on top of them, in front of them, around them. The mechanical units can't work. Therefore, we're having difficulty getting enough air, and in some instances, it's showing up in the carbon dioxide measurement, which is a general indication of enough air moving around in the space. So where we are headed now is we're pulling apart or have pulled apart all the univents. We're changing all the filters. We're changing the control valves as we were funded for this year. The boiler replacement is in progress. The boilers themselves are in place. We will be able to start in time for school, hot water and so forth. So what we're attempting to do is remove as much clutter from the room as possible. My goal, and Mr. Yaffe will not support it, is a 20% reduction in the materials in the rooms. You will note one particular concern were bacterial findings on top of some of the furniture. I was informed that we clean that furniture once every year religiously. That's not enough. So we will be able to increase the air, improve the quality of the air, and improve the quality of the cleanliness of the spaces. That will help us with the difficulties that we have discovered thus far, and I share your concern that we took a picture. It's a good picture right now. We need to remain vigilant, and as I said in this very first meeting that I had with you, we have a lot of money to put into these schools to keep them up. Questions, concerns?
Turn it over to the committee for questions. Mr. Demling?
So thanks for the summary. So not being an expert in air quality analysis, I wonder if you could speak maybe generally to what this study doesn't measure. I mean, after the first like 100 pages, it's sort of difficult for me to grasp the gestalt. That's just my own naivete. But I guess I'm just thinking about, employees or students who've been there for a long time and talk about the environment and might not be, completely convinced that, oh, it's all great now because we did a report and we're gonna move the materials around. So I don't know if that's a fair question.
Certainly. So I would assure you that that is not the end of the discussion, and our staff will continue to raise concerns in a variety of forms and formats. What the report tells us is that in a generic sense, in one of the very large caveats associated with this report, is that there are no standards for mold. There is no way to put a specific number or a specific measure or a specific definition about the concentration of mold in any given air space and how that impacts the people within it. It is a general measure of general people under general conditions. I will say that the report indicates that the airborne mold is considerably lower than the outside concentrations. So we're doing something right and then stripping it out of the air that's coming into the building. The measurement is an encouragement that we're headed in the right direction, but it is not a measurement of how the air will impact any given individual. What also is not specifically included in those are chemical sensitivities that are practically impossible to measure unless you know what you're looking for. So should those issues arise, then we need to investigate what any given individual is sensitive to and seek that out.
Thank you again for this report and for the summary. I would just like to understand a little bit about moving forward. You talked about the need to clean the systems and assuming that's going to be regular maintenance that needs to be ongoing. And then the same thing with lowering the levels of clutter. Are there any ideas about how we're going to make sure that those changes we make right before school starts stay?
I am very energetic and will continue to remain so. I am very persuasive, sir, and will remain so. It's a matter of paying attention to what is on the mechanical units, what is getting into the mechanical units, and making sure that we change the filters in a timely manner and clean the units themselves. Each kind of feeds upon the other, because if there's too much stuff in and on the unit, I can't get in to repair it. The control valves that we've changed will allow us to better control the energy going through it so that we don't have lags. We turn the button and 10 minutes later the heat comes on, as an example. The clutter within the room prohibits our cleaning desks, bookcases, smartboards, all of the areas that were found to be problematic. It is a persistent, ongoing effort. It is a give and take between the educators and the administration, and I will continue to pursue that.
Dr. Morris and Mr. Virginia.
If I could add, just both what Mr. McPherson as well as the principals have done, particularly at the two schools that were evaluated, is also increasing the education of our staff about the implications of having materials near unit events, right? So, I mean, I taught at Fort River. You wouldn't have loved my room, right? But I think what feels different than my experience all the way back is that there's more education going on of this is why. So Mr. McPherson and I, Mr. Yaffe met with a group of teachers at Wildwood. They had an MTA person who does air quality with Miss Fay. This is back in the spring, I believe. We're meeting again in a couple of weeks. And so the nice thing is I feel like we're working highly in collaboration with teachers who are concerned about the air quality, and they're getting information and then sharing it back with their colleagues. So we are functionally working together on this instead of just a simple directive. It's really more about the education, because if people know why it's a problem to have stuff right on top of a unit event, they're more likely to not have it than if it's they don't have a background. It just seems like a random request, because our educators are wonderful. They don't have myself included, don't have the skill set to truly understand the mechanics and the airflow properties that get involved when you have folks on top of blowing air. So I want to compliment you and the principals, because I think it was an important shift in terms of how we collaborate with staff.
Mr. Nakajima?
So you said that the rooms, or the tops of the surfaces of items are systematically cleaned once a year at present?
Yes.
What's the ideal schedule? And then, by the way, I don't mean ideal in a world in which we have, one cleaner per room, and they sweep through it 3 times a day, and, we have robots doing everything. In reality,
In reality, once a month would be sufficient.
and would that have, if it were on a schedule like that, would that have implications for room organization? I mean, like, would there be, I imagine in my mind, there'd be some, like, if you had, maybe this is a question for you, it might be a question for Mr. Yaffe, is that if you knew that your room was going to be cleaned once a month like that, you might organize your materials differently than you do if you're putting something up and you can just kind of forget about it for a few months.
I suggest that, given the air quality indications and the locations of the wipes in particular, that we're finding the high bacterial counts, that is not necessary. As long as my staff go through and clean the top surfaces, the horizontal surfaces, we should be able to eliminate that problem altogether.
Any other questions or comments? Mr. Demling?
So either one. Were we going to do this for Crocker Farm? And was the idea that that would be a good comparative baseline?
So that could be in the capital discussion for this year. It wasn't part of what was funded or requested last year. There haven't been significant environmental concerns from staff or the community. I'm not saying none, because I'm sure there have been, but not at the same level or tenor as the other two schools. But certainly as we get into budget season and the capital piece and JCPC, it's a worthwhile conversation to have, in my opinion.
Yeah, I just wanted to, ask you, since I'd heard from the chair and from the superintendent, that their sort of top-line review of the reports was that it allayed some of the more significant, regardless of what existed when there was carpeting down. I'm not talking about the past. I get the idea that if you had a bunch of carpeting down and it absorbing moisture and mold, that'd be a problem. But I'm saying in terms of where we are today, do you agree with the assessment that these air quality tests for Wildwood and for River are in some ways comforting to you, despite all the work to be done? Or is there, what would be your top line summary of that?
I would say that I'm encouraged that we do not have a problem at this moment in time.
Okay.
The test was taken at a good time toward the end of the year while the students were still present. I believe it is a fair representation of the conditions at the moment. And I would suggest that we need to stay on top of the causes of the problems to maintain that same level of assurance.
Thank you.
Do you feel like you have the resources you need to do the monthly cleaning and the staff and the whatever else you might need to?
So
to maintain it?
on a day-to-day basis, yes. We're refocusing our efforts to address the problem areas, and we are incrementally improving our situation overall. We've attacked the water coming into the building envelope first. We're cleaning better, we're cleaning in a different fashion. I think my first words to this committee were, I can't hold it together for another decade, and that is still true.
Mr. Demling?
How long can you hold it together for?
2 years for sure, maybe 5. It depends on the funding that we get. So the chiller, as an example, the chiller is original to the building. It blew a compressor in the last week or so of school. They don't make those chillers, compressors anymore. We had to get a remanufactured unit. We're going to have to install it ourselves because we don't have sufficient budget to hire a contractor to do that. And just for that single piece of equipment, we're looking at $150,000 to cool Wildwood. And that similar condition exists in all of our facilities.
So I have just one follow-up question. I think you mentioned it previously, the elevated carbon dioxide levels.
Yeah.
Again, I'm not an expert on any of this, but just from what I could glean from the report and the assessments and all of that, it would seem to point to a air circulation problem in the buildings, right? And this is true for both Wildwood and Fort River. I don't know, if there is some sort of physical effect or anything like that people can expect from that. I don't want to raise an alarm. It doesn't seem like it's that high that it would be alarming. However, again, thinking about people who are sensitive or anything like that, it immediately makes me wonder if there are specific and smaller sort of concrete steps that we can take in the immediate future to address any concerns that might arise from that issue in particular, right? So how do we improve air circulation in these buildings that you have taken steps multiple times in the past to articulate our problem because
Yes.
of the way that the circulation works and all of that? So how, what can we do in the next 2 to 5 years to make those changes happen as we work our way through bigger questions?
So the univents are a defective design. You cannot sustain the function of the schools with the univents, not at an adequate long-term level. To centralize the mechanical function will be in the multi-million-dollar range, but it will be necessary at each school. So the roof goes first, then the mechanical systems will follow behind that. Prevent the water from getting in and then control it once it's in. Humidity control is extremely limited. The higher the humidity, the greater the biological growth. I'm not concerned about the ventilation rate. We can move enough air in the buildings with the current systems. It will not be appropriately conditioned to optimize the learning environment or the health of the building in general. So changing the filters, making sure they're changed, making sure the fans are working, making sure the windows are closed when the building is trying to cool itself, making sure the windows are closed when the building is trying to heat itself, making sure that we don't have reservoirs of biological growth in cardboard, paper, books, will help us make the next few years, but we need to change the way the mechanical systems operate. And hand in hand with that are the electrical systems, because again, they're original to the building. They're nearly as old as I am.
Mr. Demling?
So I don't mean to open up a subtopic, but and if I do, I'm fine deferring it to a future meeting. But I'm kind of hung up on this "keep it together" notion. That maybe 5 is kind of the first time I've heard a specific number addressed on this building, and I think the last time this general theme came up was when we were talking about the capital plan for the next X number of fiscal years, and we were combining the maintenance costs, the planned maintenance costs for Fort River and Wildwood, and it was in the multi-million-dollar range. So when you say keeping it together, do you mean after 5 years, it may not be cost efficient to keep it, or we literally, like, without a astronomical amount of funds, won't be able to sustain the building.
So 2 examples. The roof right now. The roof membrane is fracturing periodically. There is no way to patch it consistently. There is no way to prevent the continuing fracture, I'm calling it. It's a brittle inner tube from our youth. It's cracking, it's going to continue to crack, and eventually the cracks are going to run faster than I can catch up. The mechanical units, we purchased a rebuilt, remanufactured compressor for the chiller. The time will come shortly where we won't be able to. I suspect we will not be able to manufacture the parts that we need in-house to support those pieces of mechanical equipment, so it will become prohibitively expensive first, and then it will become physically impossible. Sorry.
Thank you. No, it's good. I mean, it's information we should, be paying attention to sooner rather than later, so I appreciate it.
So with that, I would like to propose, if the committee's okay with it, that maybe we have, periodic updates about the status of the buildings. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yes.
I think, we've heard enough from the community about concerns about keeping moving forward on all of this, right? Concerns that have been raised, in past years, among educators and others. But it sounds like something that is worth hearing from you, particularly Mr. McPherson, on
Sure, that's okay.
the state of our current buildings and what's being done to try to mitigate some of these problems. And I think especially around, the ventilation, air circulation, mechanical problems, the roof, all of that, right? And we have heard from you here and there, but maybe every few months would be great just to get it on the agenda and, get an update from you, Dr. Morris.
Okay, just 2 things. I really like that idea, and I think one of the things that when we get to capital planning, I don't want the committee or Mr. McPherson to feel like it's a rush, right? So I think having more regular updates when we get into capital, it lays out both for the public as well as for the larger community and us, here's where the problems, here's the logical next step we would make, so that we have a thoughtful way to approach some pretty significant long-term problems related to our infrastructure. So I really like that kind of consistent update, so that I think it'll flow really nicely into the JCPC process.
Great.
And I want to appreciate Mr. McPherson for his comprehensiveness of his work. It's great.
Absolutely, thank you very much. Any further comments or thoughts on this, and otherwise we're just going to move on? Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Okay, the next item on our agenda is dual language and school identity update. The committee had 2 meetings over the summer, specifically on this issue, and I mentioned that sort of at the beginning of the meeting. And the minutes were just approved tonight, and they can be found online on the website shortly. We met to hear from the superintendent a few different proposed approaches that we could take on the dual language program, and to discuss some of the concerns for each model. The committee asked the superintendent to get input from principals, from CPAC, from educators, from others in the district, and just to, help inform our thinking, right? And this is, following a couple of very robust conversations that we had initially about what we could be doing in terms of dual language following a presentation. And I'm rehashing all of this for people who are just tuning in. But we obviously realize that there's a long way to go before the committee is ready to make a decision. And we want to make sure the community has ample opportunity to weigh in. So that's where a lot of this work now is sort of pivoting, if you will, right? To present kind of our thinking right now, where we are. And we understand that, all of these decisions are going to impact, both children's educational experiences as well as family schedules and all of that. So the committee gave some feedback to Dr. Morris over those summer meetings. And then the result is the presentation tonight. So with that, I'm going to turn over to Dr. Morris, so you can take it from here.
Sure, and so it's important to note that the topic is dual language and school identity update. The reason there wasn't too many slides on school identity is the 2 days of workshops were yesterday and today. So it's not because that work's not important, and I will talk about it throughout, particularly at the end of the presentation, but it's just the timing of it didn't allow for more robust presenting on the results of the last 2 days for Wildwood and Crocker Farm. But I just wanted to put that disclaimer out there because it could be perceived that way, rightfully so. But and then for the dual language piece, I'm going to spend the first bulk of the slides are really about the zoning, and then I think I'd actually like to stop and take questions, and then talk about the La Siembra and the academic programming discussion, because they're really two distinct things, and there's a relationship between them. But I'd like to keep them sort of separate, if it's okay with the chair and the committee.
Yeah, works for me.
So I know it's all sort of
Nodding
wrapped in.
heads.
Yeah, and so the same problem with the cameras means that doesn't have power either.
Oh,
So we're
There's
not
one
screening
screen
back
there.
here, okay.
But this presentation is in the packet, so if you have the packet, you have the presentation. I probably won't remember to do the slides because it's behind me, so I apologize in advance. So I'm going to try my best, but Peter's going to cue me when I forget, because
And
it's going to be my
perhaps
site view.
Amherst Media is focused a little bit on that anyway, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. That's why I really want to make sure I do
Yeah.
the slides. So as Mr. Donis was saying, we've had prior and ongoing stakeholder feedback, including elementary principals, teachers and staff at Fort River in particular, CPAC, and that's ongoing as well. We're meeting again with the special ed group on Thursday. We've had some forums, enrollment working group and their excellent work, survey that they did, and again, there'll be more of that to come. And certainly we've talked about a lot, particularly over the last couple months here, last 2 months here at school committee. And some of the priorities that I feel strongly should be considered in any option. One, and this was reinforced, and it says add local data, that gets added a slide or two later. So I apologize for that typo when I was putting this together. I didn't expect to be out today, so life happens. So I'll talk about the local data in a minute. But one of the things that was reinforced over and over and over again is that increasing the number of proficient, and I'll talk about proficiency in a minute, Spanish speakers at the site of the dual language school is critically important from the academic programming point of view. And that's a nice crossover in terms of the zoning, those two things. It's one place where they really overlap. School capacity, Fort River has excess capacity right now. It's been about 80% larger than it currently is in the past. Not that we want to get back there. I was teaching there, it was very full. Crocker Farm doesn't have enough space right now for small group rooms for ELL, Title I, and we'll take a look at Crocker Farm's enrollment in a minute so you can project it forward and see the issue that may emerge as soon as a year from now. We talked about exploring that, with La Siembra last week, having 2 classrooms for a dual language program and a third monolingual classroom is still, kind of being explored as the primary model, though we'll look at a couple different ones throughout this presentation. Siblings is a huge one. That every community we speak to, siblings or having some sibling preferences is very important. Having students in multiple schools is a real challenge for families at the elementary level. Socioeconomic diversity, this isn't new data, but right now we do have a bit of a split between the economically disadvantaged percentage of the schools and transportation, both time on buses and the amount of resources we want to dedicate to transportation as opposed to our students and the staff. So concentration of Spanish speakers, we got a little more complex on this over the last, with La Siembra, which was a training that happened last week around dual language programming.
Do you want me to beep like a film script?
Oh, I would love that actually, that would bring me back.
Film script for anybody who remembers that.
Yeah, I do. So an analysis of our K-2 population, because we noticed there was a distinction.
That's helpful.
That would be really, he may still wants to. That there was a distinction between our primary grade and upper grade data in terms of demographics, that we've seen the demographic shift over time. So here's some limitations of our data. So we know that about a little more than 10% of our students speak Spanish as a first language. And there were roughly similar percentages across the district. There wasn't one school that, the delta wasn't statistically significant between Fort River, Wildwood, and Crocker Farm. The second point is one I want to go into in a little more depth. That there's an unknown number of students who are above and beyond the 10.6% who are partially bilingual in Spanish and English. One of the things that was reinforced to us in the La Siembra workshop was the old model of it was a binary model. Either you're bilingual or you speak Spanish or you don't. And that might have made sense 40 years ago in the United States. It makes little to no sense right now because there's really a spectrum, which we'll look at in a second, of language speakers. And so really we're trying to what they're helping us do is get away from we use a very typical home language survey. And I'll show you an example of one of the presenters, what they use in another community in Connecticut that has a dual language program that gets much finer grained data that's instructionally much more valuable than the data that's on this page. So the initial goal from MAVE's guidance is to reach at least a third of a cohort having some Spanish language competency, and again, within that third, you want to have some range from truly that's Spanish the first language to some level of familiarity, and that's okay. And so just to put in numbers on it, if we thought of 40 kindergartners in the fall of 2019, the minimum would be 14 of them having some language experience in Spanish, and the more is better. So 14, and minimum is bold and underlined for a reason. But as we think about this, I just wanted to start getting to the place where we're quantifying what that would actually look like. And the next page, I want to give credit to Connecticut, is North Windham, Connecticut. And they were, it's like many other communities, they were doing this standard home language survey, and they were saying this gives us like not the data that we need. So this is essentially what their home language, the home language survey looks like for families who are interested in joining the dual language program. So you can see that it's based on a spectrum from Spanish only know English to English only know Spanish, but it includes all those in between. And what we find in our community, much like their community, is that middle group prefers English, speaks Spanish when necessary, or prefers Spanish, speaks English when necessary. Those are really common for our students entering our schools. Number of reasons for that, one of which is that many of our students who speak Spanish as their first language attend English-speaking preschools. One of the other things that gets a little more nuanced that I put in here is what's the academic language and what's the social language. So another really typical thing for us and for them, students whose social language is clearly the first language is in Spanish, and academic language because their formal academic background has been in English, and so that it gets a little more nuanced, but this is looking at this as a continuum instead of a binary system. We spent a lot of time at last Amber talking about that, and I think it really does inform our thinking about what is the demographics we want and what's the language skill sets we want. We certainly want lots of students in the right hand of this chart, but we also don't want to exclude students who speak Spanish when necessary. There's still going to be language models for their monolingual English-speaking counterpoints, even if they're not technically bilingual. Many families, frankly, just wouldn't even put in our home language survey because they feel like, yeah, we speak some Spanish at home, but our primary language is English. Students are still going to come with assets to the program. And so really helpful to look at what other districts are doing and to have some training on that. So it gets more complex, not less complex, but I think that's a good thing. I think it's much more representative of who our students are. And the last slide in this intro section probably requires more time than we have in this meeting just to talk about Crocker Farm enrollments, but it's to note kindergarten number's a little higher than when I last looked at it. I think it's now at 57, so I can correct that. But we're looking at 3 sections of Crocker Farm. Lots of people registering this time of year who just recently moved to town. So the caution is, one of the questions that came up at the last meeting we had was, how far away are we from having a real space crisis at Crocker Farm? And so what you notice is that we've got the 2 graduating 6th grade classes this spring. So in June, we'll have 2 classes leave. So the challenge is, if we have 3 come in, we don't particularly have a space for where that 3rd class would be. Space, for those of you who've been to Crocker Farm or have heard Mr. Shea talk about it, or who experience it as a parent, space is at a premium there, and to think of taking another full classroom space pushes special ed ELL spaces in ways that are uncomfortable and borderline not consistent with state regulations. Because there are state regulations about where special ed and ELL spaces can be, right? The days of closets and things like that are rightfully not allowed anymore. So a significant caution for us looking at next year's enrollments, separate even from dual language programming, is what does this look like next year if we do, like this year, have a high number of kindergarten students enroll at Crocker Farm School? The other option obviously is looking at, some of these sections where we have 3, can we make it into 2 and have large class sizes, which makes lots of people really happy. Shouldn't be facetious about that, it's a serious issue, but we will rightfully hear from the community of staff and parent guardians if the solution is that all of a sudden classes that were comfortably at 17 or 18 are now at 24 because of the space issue. So this is a real conundrum that we certainly can talk about as we do the presentation, as the presentation goes, but I think we're going to need to consistently come back to And it could connect to dual language program, it doesn't necessarily have to, because even if dual language program doesn't happen, this problem's not gonna go away. Thought I'd pause here and before I dig into, kind of the 4 options that I have to present, looking more specifically at dual language enrollment zoning.
Any questions from the committee? Mr. Temlin?
So we've been talking about October-ish as kind of a target date for the committee making a decision about the dual language program. What in your view is a target deadline for making a decision about enrollment zones that impact at least Crocker Farm?
Yeah, I would say across the district, I wouldn't want to make specific ones, because any enrollment decision you make about Crocker Farm affects the other 2 schools in some way or the other. So what we talked about last time, I think, was sometime in like January, felt about right and gives people enough of a heads up. The challenge, and you'll see this in the presentation, is it depends, of course it always depends, but it sort of depends how drastic an enrollment change we're talking about, because having been through at least one significant enrollment change in my experience in the district, the more time ahead to plan to support families and students, that was part and parcel of the success of that shift, was that it didn't feel rushed to anyone, however they felt about the change. I think we did right by supporting everyone to make those changes. So sorry to do a conditional kind of response, but that's my response as of now.
Mr. Demling?
So I had some further thoughts on this, but we went through a version of these slides at our previous summer meeting. So I think the next one is actually a pretty good example that uncovers more of the issues. So I'll pause, but just to let you know that we'll be sidetracking back to this slide.
Absolutely, the pause for questions wasn't intended to. It is supposed to be a presentation that builds on one itself. I just didn't want to go too far down the road before stepping in.
One small question. We've talked about Fort River having lots of space and Crocker Farm having very little space. Can you just fill us in on what Wildwood status is?
Yeah, so my sense of Wildwood is it's sort of at a comfortable capacity. It means there's not space laying around that no one's using, but when we need a space, we can find one for small group rooms, for instrumental music, which is always tricky, and we'll have one more space in the building next. Not the year starting in a couple of weeks, but the following year, because we have a grade that's the largest grade in the school, which has 4 classes, which will be in 6th grade and then graduate out.
Yeah. One follow-up. Is this trend in the increase in kindergarten across the board, or is it particular to Crocker Farm?
No. So if you look at Crocker Farm, I mean, there's a little bit of a jump, but if you look at
Just the 20% difference.
Right, if you look at 3rd through 5th grade, that's sort of where we're sitting. We had 2 lower years. Wildwood is pretty consistent where they've been. They're also at high 50s. And Fort River is at 40. So I would say we are having an upward trend, but I think all the schools are, a little fuller than they've been. Our kindergarten classes, as a result, will be more closer to 20, which ideally we're at 17, 18. So we're not increasing the number of sections, the class size overall, although Crocker Farms will have one more. But overall, we're seeing the upward trend, and it's hard to know what it's too soon to know exactly what is causing that. Nothing in the census would have indicated that, because we look at census data, which is about 60%. It picks up in Amherst about 60% of who we think, because we'll get 5 years old census data, and we look at live births, and our community has some transiency, as every community does. And so it's a little bit of a surprise that we had the uptick, but I think we'll have to see over time, and as families come in, try to assess whether that's fewer families making other choices. Is it just something that couldn't be captured in the census with live births that we're seeing? It's a little too soon to tell.
Can we move on?
Sure, so potential options for consideration. There's 4 options we'll talk about. For those of you who followed our last meeting, there's one more based on feedback that the committee offered. So option 1 is a hybrid model that includes a neighborhood school plus a lottery system. The map that's on the page is the same as the current enrollment map. There's no change to the map. And the basic structure of a hybrid system is that the first part of the classroom composition is Fort River zone students enroll by a certain date, because you can't, if it's a lottery, you have to have a lottery at a certain date. Talking to other districts, most of them try to do it by April 1st or May 1st, so that it's enough time for other families to apply in a lottery, and everyone knows where they're going to school, before the summer, which seems important to many families. Some of the southern states, it's usually they're earlier, but they end school earlier, so, but I think the goal is the same everywhere, which is lottery's done, everyone knows before, like older siblings or other people, before school lets out, everyone has clarity. And so that with the excess, you'd fill the rest of the classrooms with Amherst resident students who are zoned to either Crocker Farm or Wildwood by a lottery. So if you look at the past couple of years, you'd have, by our registration by April 1st, we generally have about 25 students enrolled at Fort River. It ranges, some years it's been as low as 22, 23, some years it's been high as 28, 29, but that's the ballpark the last 5 years, has been between 22 and 28. And so that would leave, around 15 slots by a lottery, if everyone chose to attend the dual language school who registered at Fort River, which we know, based on other districts' experience, is not going to be the case. So it would lead to some robust opportunities for a lottery system to have students participate in it. And just I want to clarify that because we talk a lot about the general enthusiasm in the community for dual language program, which I believe is true, and when people are making individual choices, that general enthusiasm doesn't always match with what parents, guardians feel like was best for their child, and there's no critique in that. I just, people sometimes say, well, everyone will want to do it, and I've talked to other districts who perceive that was going to be the case, and that tends not to be the case, particularly the first couple of years. Over time, as the programs go successful, the yield ends up being higher and higher and higher of families who do it. Being new is hard. So some of the benefits, could better match the school capacity number of students attending Crocker and Fort River, could much more easily be phased in without disrupting older student experiences compared to some other models we'll look at. Based on the lottery, how we structure it could provide more Spanish language models for the dual language program, which we talked about earlier. Provide some flexibility, right? There's a lot of other things going on in the community, regionalization, specialized program. We heard Mr. McPherson just say lifespan of buildings is a question mark. So it's important for us, and this came up at multiple school committee meetings in the summer, that whatever model we go to is flexible, where if there's another change, it's not like, oh my God, what do we do with this? We've created this, we've locked in this program that doesn't allow for other changes the district may be interested in or the town may be interested in. And transportation, which I have much more information, or some more information, which I'll talk about a bit, but we do believe that there'll be a potentially low impact on transportation, particularly on the cost factor. So some of the cautions, again, transportation costs, would increase, although we have a potential solution that we worked on with Mr. McPherson this morning. So I'll talk about that again a little bit later. Identifying the factors, every community says there's functional challenges and there's political challenges, and those are two very different things as we think about a lottery. Siblings, one of the things to note is that, and we talked about this before, but I just want to, not everyone was in the room, we weren't on camera. For families who have older siblings already in the schools, there's not necessarily slots. Someone raised, well, if a child in the fall, kindergarten child in the fall of 2019 was to get into Fort River by a lottery, could their older sibling also go to Fort River? And Fort River classes, they're pretty capped. They have our highest class size right now in the district. And there's not necessarily excess room unless we wanted to add sections and cost to add all upper grade students who may be siblings. So, just to be really clear from the beginning that when I'm talking about siblings, I'm really talking about potentially siblings into the future. I'm not sure there's a clear pathway to include older siblings who are already in the school who may want to switch to Fort River.
Sorry to interrupt, Dr. Morris, but I just wanted to clarify the statement that you just made, because we just heard that Fort River has a lot of space. It's got physical space. Right. But what you're talking about is that we would then have to increase the number of classes that we actually have, which means educators, additional educators, and all that, right?
Exactly, yes.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean physical space. It was financial capacity.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify.
Yeah. No,
that
it's two very different.
People's heads may be spinning. They're like, wait a minute, I thought we were just talking about how much space Fort River has. Yeah.
And please slow me down, because we went through about 80% of these before, and maybe going quicker than would be helpful for the public. So thank you for that. And then socioeconomic diversity may respond. Other districts have experienced that, and this is both, could be a benefit, could be a challenge, or it probably will be both, I would say. is that many families will try to move into the district that has a dual language program, and those tend to be families with means. So Fort River right now has the highest poverty rate. So that we can mitigate it, but was that a good thing or not? I think it's something we're gonna have to flush out over time. I think it's complicated to think through that, but it wouldn't be by design. Well, those averages will even out because I think as we talked about before, putting socioeconomic diversity into a lottery, which would advantage upper income families to get into a program, seems really consistent with district values. It would balance out diversity, socioeconomic diversity, but it'd feel awkward at best. And so, some questions. What factors would be considered in the lottery, which I'll get into in a second. Siblings, how to approach that conundrum, and transportation. So I want to talk a little bit about transportation. So I virtually met with Mr. McPherson and Peter Krause, who's our transportation coordinator, this morning, and one of the things that we talked about was what would be the most logical way, separate from a cost perspective, just logical way where we would have buses get students from across town to Fort River if they got in through a lottery system. Cost is definitely a factor, but I just wanted to think through logistically what makes sense. So what we came up with, at least for the moment, and we'll need to do more work on this, is the most logical system would be a two-stop system. So families, and there's one caveat to this, which is East Hadley Road. So don't think about East Hadley Road, think about the rest of the town for a moment. That families would take the buses they've always taken or have always been routed for. And let's say you were a Wildwood family. You'd get off at Wildwood. There'd be someplace an adult who watched students, and as students who were in the lottery, they would all get on a bus, and a bus driver would take those students from Wildwood to Fort River. So the downside of that is there is more time in a bus, about 5 minutes from the Wildwood, about 8 or 9 minutes from Crocker Farm, and that's the waiting piece. We're trying to get much more details on kind of quantifying what that would be. But all the other models we looked at either increased, the number of buses, the number of drivers, not just from a cost perspective, but just from a logistical perspective. Having multiple buses going to the same streets was something that they expressed levels of concern about. We already do have this model in small scale for some of our specialized programs. There is some places where this same model of a two-stop system occurs, and it occurs successfully. It would be essentially cost neutral because, as you know, our transportation system uses some of our own drivers as well as 5-star. And in this model, we'd be using our own drivers who, literally, the Crocker Farm, that person's going back to the middle school anyway, so it's just adding a stop at Fort River on the way and then continuing their route to the middle school for their other work. And so we still have to work out more details, but we looked at a bunch of other ways to think about it, and none of them seemed practical. East Hadley Road, the caveat is because we already have multiple buses, we have multiple buses going to multiple schools for one area, one geographic area. There might be some efficiencies that are realized and not need a two-stop system. For instance, it would make no sense to us to have a student get on a bus in living on East Hadley Road, go to Wildwood to then literally, you'd almost drive right past Fort River to get to Wildwood from there and then loop back. That just doesn't make logical sense. So there might be some efficiencies because we already have multiple buses going to multiple schools in the same area. And efficiencies in a positive way, both for students and time on bus, but also, we could maybe get our systems being a little more efficient in that part of town as well. So that's the update on the transportation. So looking at other hybrid lottery systems, and there's one additional one that wasn't on here the last time, which will reference back to a slide I showed earlier. The 3 in red, they're in red not because I'm suggesting they're perfect, but because they're different systems than what I talked about in the spring when this similar slide was presented. Chelsea, Harrisonburg, and Wyndham all use a system where there's a specific number of slots in the dual language program for students with and without Spanish language proficiency. So essentially there's multiple lotteries. The lottery for students with levels of Spanish proficiency is the primary lottery to fill what's the instructionally recommended demographics. If that's filled, then those students blend and then it becomes more of a general lottery. Mm-hmm. But it's a way to sort of guarantee that system. The complication with Wyndham, I think that's the right word for it, is they're the ones who developed that continuum that you saw earlier. And so they actually have 3 lotteries now. They have a fully fluent, some fluency, and without Spanish language proficiency. But that's based on their experience, multiple years, their compañero school. So these are all things we're looking at, and it's nice that we're able to talk to people, and I'll be in Harrisonburg next month, talk to them about how their system's functioning for them. But I do think the other systems, when I've spoken to them, the lottery, I guess I prefer lotteries that are more clear and more transparent of exactly what we're trying to do. So if we're saying, I put 14 out as a minimum, we might come to the conclusion we really want it to be closer to 16, 18. And we're really clear, this is what the benefit, the needs of the program, and we say that to everybody, and there's no questioning, how did someone get in? It's, we had 7 students from Fort River who registered who fit that profile. We're gonna have a lottery for 10 more, from the other 2 schools, or however it plays out. I really prefer the transparent approach than something that could feel vague to the larger community. And that's, so the reason they're in red is because I think in our community that'll be highly appreciated. Even if people don't agree with it, or they feel like it's not what they would choose, clarity is something that I think is essential in this complicated process.
Mr.
I was gonna say, I also just like it because, I did agree with you on the clarity part. I also think that when we're looking at filling in enrollment from Crocker and Wildwood, it gives greater, I guess it is transparency, just clarity around what we're trying to achieve and do. But I also think since, again, we're talking about launching a program, it's brand new to us, and it's been repeated many times, that having, I don't like really calling kids models, but having some level of language proficient children, up to a certain percentage, is considered a predicate to a successful program, and you've said that repeatedly through different points of emphasis and evidence. I don't know how you do that without basically just saying, look, we have an objective we're trying to reach, and we're literally going to set our targets to try to reach that goal. And that just makes sense to me.
Yeah, thank you. So the entry points, for me, the Spanish language background, you've already heard me say that. The siblings piece has to be baked in, even if it's in the future. Oops, sorry. And the cohort sizes at Crocker Farm and Wildwood. So Mr. Demling's point earlier in that chart, thinking about Crocker Farm, whether there's some priority or not priority in this, it's still something that we're going to have to deal with. So I think over the next 2 meetings, I'd like to really parse through, and we can certainly talk about tonight, but really dig deep into what do we want to include as part of the dual language piece, and what do we just say is a straight enrollment issue and unrelated to that. Because I think that there's some complicated logistics, politics, and reality for kids and families. So the possible transportation model, right, I think it's worth forgetting about that bottom of that slide. This was, again, a conversation that happened this morning. It's summer schedules, people on vacation, and I didn't want to edit a slide that was already made public, but I think I've already talked about the transportation model we looked at, and East Hadley Road might have some benefits, but we're looking at models that all students would be able to have transportation, albeit it might be a longer trip.
Mr. McAdoo?
So are you, do you think in a future iteration, I don't know how we would do this. How would we model what the downstream impact would be of doing a lottery that included Crocker, and trying to understand how that might alleviate some of the space concerns down the road, if in fact it does, under what variables, what circumstances it would do that.
Yeah.
We want to get into that later, but I just mean to me, it's just an interesting question, and I can't immediately visualize what literally the mechanical process would be of setting up a lottery that would then provide some sort of like fair shot at getting in to kids from both schools, but also presumably you'd be putting in some sort of weight or value to the idea that if we were alleviating space concerns at Crocker, that was a worthwhile consideration for the school district to have as one of the components of the lottery, right?
Yeah, I think my preference on that, and we certainly can talk about it tonight, is to come back in September with a clear sense of space use at Crocker Farm, to understand at a finer level what would happen if we had 3 classes, what are possible options, and then have that dovetail into this conversation. So, I think perhaps oversimplified the earlier conversation about space at Crocker Farm. But I think it's worth looking at a map and saying, where are our classes? What are space needs at Crocker Farm? And are we going to address them regardless of whether this flies or not? Like, are some students who are zoned for Crocker Farm next year potentially not going to go there, not by choice? Because I think that puts a different English on the ball, so to speak, of how we talk about this conversation. Because if we know if there's 58 kids again, or 57 students, that we don't have a great space for that third kindergarten classroom, I think that impacts us. But I think we need to do a little more internal work and bring that back to you in September.
Yeah, that's the reason why I was asking, really, because so that's valuable
Yeah.
context and follow-up, because one of the principles we talked about, which obviously isn't like an inviolable principle of the school committee, but one of the principles we talked about over the summer was if we were knowing that there were many other variables that were in play in our school district, we were trying to do the least long-term, I say harm's the wrong word, but my point is, put a structure in place that now starts creating significant downstream implications that impact other decisions that we just don't have enough information on. And so in this case, the bias I run with is the bias we had over the summer, that if we thought we could reasonably relieve space considerations on Crocker through some kind of a lottery that was otherwise voluntary on the part of the parents and the kids, that sounds like an awesome solution, but then we need more information to know if that's actually viable, right?
Absolutely. And so that's what we want to provide for you in September.
Mr. Demling?
So I'll save part B of my enrollment zone comment for after option 2, because I think that's a good example. But just to follow up on what Mr. Nakajima was saying, yeah, I think there are real concerns that the devil's in the details here in terms of how much this potential lottery could accomplish with the weights. You know, if we're relying on that as the mechanism that has to relieve the enrollment numbers from Crocker, you know, and like you said, the lottery would be done in April or May, and we don't know our actual class capacity, final class capacity, until August-ish. There's certainly the potential that we could, you know, be wanting to get the Spanish language proficient students into the class, maybe weight that higher. You know, we could take X number of Crocker students, and we get in the middle of the summer and we say, uh-oh, what are we going to do about the rest of the enrollment? So I find that I find it significantly problematic to rely on that as the only mechanism to offload the Crocker. And yeah, I guess the other general comment I'll have is that any of these solutions, I think we're going to find things to pick apart and point out as imperfections, but I'm sort of looking at it big picture that right now we have an imperfect enrollment zone policy and no dual language program. And, you know, do we want to consider having another imperfect enrollment zone with a dual language program that has an imperfect lottery? So it's like, I think if perfection is the enemy of the good, then we'll definitely not go anywhere. So I'm sort of, even though my comments may seem, you know, pointedly critical, I'm trying to get to the best possible solution.
I'm not perceiving them that way, so.
And just one
Yeah,
quick
please.
comment also. I think just building on what we've been talking about before, I think, you know, we keep hearing the words, we want to have a successful program. And I think ultimately we need to boil down what we mean by success, right? Like, what is it that we're actually aiming for? You know, because I think that'll end up impacting the decisions that we make about not just enrollment, but also, you know, the makeup of each individual class. Does a successful program actually mean that we have more Spanish speakers who are fluent, you know, and who can communicate and, you know, and all that? Does it mean, you know, empowering students whose language may not be English to get to a level of mastery and comfort in school, period? You know, there's a few different factors that need to be weighed, right, about, you know, kind of where we want to get. I don't think we've answered that question yet, right? And so in my mind, when we're talking about all these different details, you know, it really begs that big question: what does success actually look like? What goal are we aiming for? You know, I want to be able to answer that before we even can delve into the transportation questions and the, you know, the makeup and the lottery and all of that, right? I think that there has to be this, you know, this almost philosophical decision made about where we want to be, and then everything else starts to fall into place.
Yeah, and
You know, one of the funny things about that is that we've understandably done this, but since early summer, we've been deferring. It's a lot of Siembra?
Siembra.
La Siembra, yeah.
Yes, we've been deferring the La Siembra conversation. So in essence, we've been looking at all the logistical space sort of management considerations and leaving as an empty, other than we talked about earlier in the spring, as an empty bucket, the discussion of, so what's actually happening in the classroom?
Right.
And how do we understand what it is and how do we understand whether it's working?
Mm-hmm.
And understandably, we've been deferring it, you guys have been working on it, but I think I agree, because we need to look at that bucket.
Yeah.
Absolutely, and we'll do a little bit of that today. I'll do more of a process piece of what we've worked on and what we're working on. I think the MABE presenters, so one was, Phyllis Hardy was there, you met, but there was, she was there more as a support. One of the presenters was a retired teacher at the Barbary School in Framingham, which is a very long-standing dual language school. They're actually trying to expand multiple new dual language schools in Framingham, and they're very appreciative of what they feel like is a thoughtful, cautious approach that we're taking, because doing multiple schools at once is a real challenge. The other is a current teacher leader in North Windham, Connecticut, and they work, one's an 80-20 school, one's a 50-50 school, so they have different models. And so it was really helpful, and the thing that both of them, as well as Phyllis said, is school boards in Connecticut, school committees in Massachusetts, all get to the same place, is where are they comfortable taking the leap? Because it's a chicken or the egg thing where you want to have enough information, but the example they use is we're not going to be able to lay out exactly what the schedule is going to look like. We did a lot of work on schedule last week and what would be in Spanish, what would be in English, and that's going to be a 9-month conversation. It's not going to be something that's going to be resolved by October in a finite way. We could show you other models, what we're thinking about, but to your point, the philosophical piece is certainly, we've worked on mission statement, we've worked on things that are very connected, but it's really hard, I just want to say it out loud, for school boards, school committees who have to commit to it based on the planning that's needed before, as compared to most things where you'd have like a really neat document that describes exactly what's going to happen. And their experience is no one has that 10 months ahead of time. But waiting till March or April, that means we're waiting another, and so there's this challenge, and Princeton got into it as well. I mean, my visit there, they had, they couldn't make the decision soon enough, and they ended up doing a K-1 start afterwards, and they were really regretting the one, but they promised the parents had anticipated being able to start. So I think it's really hard to be in your situation. This isn't like I'm being, truly transparent that every committee ends up being in a place 9-10 months before a program hypothetically starts where do they have enough information to feel comfortable moving forward? And the answers for almost everyone from what they tell me is like, sort of, right? But it's not like we've got the architectural designs and, we've got to use an analogy from another field. That's not where we'll be, but the core mission, the core philosophy, absolutely has to be in place. We're working on budget, as one of the primary drivers in the front end, because we know that's something that, for you all to feel comfortable taking a vote, having a philosophy of the mission, having a budget, having a sense of the curricular alignment plan. Those are the things that are the primary focus of the next couple months of work for that group. But there's other things that I'll want to know that we're going to be like, we're working on it. Here's where we are, and I think that's the tension point of this.
Thank you.
Sorry, I know it's a long aside, but I thought it was an important one to share.
I appreciate it.
So option 2, change the enrollment map. So increase the size of the Fort River catchment area so that it goes up to 3. Typically there's 2 classes per grade level at Fort River, and reduce the size based on our earlier conversation of the Crocker Farm catchment area. I want to be really clear, it's a thought experiment, right? So the goal was to keep residential neighborhoods together in the same school, maintain similar bus or travel times, and have enough students change from Crocker Farm to Fort River to better fit the capacity. There's an additional caveat, there's weird stuff like bold and italics and things that I don't usually put in, underlining on slides, but this is not a map that's being proposed. I want to be like no one should leave, if one thing you remember is Mike didn't propose a new map, right? You can forget everything else, I'll be okay. It's just a way to illustrate the types of changes and the type of approach that would be used. I don't want anyone to go see this on TV or anyone who's here say, I can't believe this street is, right? So this is not a process we would have a thorough process.
One thing you might consider along those lines is also just stamping this somehow across the image itself,
Right,
right? Just to say that this is not an actual map, right?
Yeah. our journalists in the room will be sure to take that caveat, right? So this is one that could work. Again, the capital C could, and really it was a thought experiment of how could we look at the criteria I laid out, which is residential zoning, so how do we keep neighborhoods together, the travel times, and about 70 students, switching over from Crocker Farm to Fort River. I want to say also, I said this in the other meeting, this is not an option I'm proposing or supporting, right? I'm looking at multiple options. You all may say, no, Mike, option 2, you really need to dig deeper on that. And I don't mean that, again, facetiously, but in my professional judgment, this is not where I'd go. But I think we have to go through the authentic exploration of kind of all the viable options. This is viable, I just don't think it's preferable, or I think it'd be politically difficult as well. And there's the biggest one for me is the academic program doesn't fit. But just to be clear, the 2 red stars are where Crocker Farm and Fort River are located. There might be some questions about areas in the west side of, the pink is what would be changed from Crocker Farm to Fort River. And because Crocker Farm, the buses, you have to get to 116 to get on it. Even some of the areas that look like they're incredibly closer to Crocker Farm, when you actually map out the bus routes, they're not that much closer because Fort River's right on Southeast Street. So this is the demographics of who would change under this model. You can see it's a relatively homogeneous group in terms of language proficiency. It is a homogeneous group in terms of at least ELL status, which is the same as language proficiency, but there's a correlation there. Much more homogeneous in terms of race, ethnicity, food use, lunch than our general population. So some of the benefits of such a model is it increased the match between the size piece, maintains people really like quote unquote neighborhood schools. It would maintain that, or neighborhoods would be kept together. It'd be really predictable. There wouldn't be a lottery process. So the political and then realistic challenges that come from that would go away. From socioeconomic diversity, it would balance out the schools pretty clearly, and siblings wouldn't be an issue. The cautions of the phasing. There's not a great way to phase this. So the only way to phase it really from a practical, logistical busing perspective is that the vast majority of students would be changing schools and not in the dual language program. From an academic program perspective, which we've talked about multiple times tonight, it'd be a horrible match. We would be lowering the percentage of Spanish speakers, which is the opposite of what we want to do. It's also just, to Mr. Nakajima's point earlier, right, if other changes happen, then this changes again, that starts feeling like the do no wrong piece is not good. I realized that the rest of the presentation didn't.
I apologize for that. I don't know how that got left
So
out.
I will turn around.
Oh, you don't have it either?
No, I have the same one.
I was going to say, I knew we didn't have it. I was
No, it somehow when it printed, I left those pictures.
But I can take that.
Yeah, please.
Just to leave you. Thank you for doing that. Timing advance notice. I referenced that before. That last time around we did it about 15 months in advance. Gave us 2 summers, which I think we needed 2 summers to do that well. What would the community response be? I have significant concerns about that many students from Crocker Farm being moved to Fort River, especially those students not part of the dual language program in grades 1 through 6, and the future planning piece, which I just spoke about. Ooh, so I'll do questions, and I know Mr. Demling wanted to jump in. He said after option 2.
So yeah, I agree with you that this is not a preferable solution right now. And I understand that because it doesn't increase the Spanish language proficiency population, it's not a benefit to the program. More broadly for the Crocker enrollment issue, the reason why I think it's not a good idea right now is because of the unknowns that you mentioned in the last bullet there. But it does seem like this is something, not option 2 necessarily, but that changing the enrollment zone lines is something we're going to have to look at soonish. Now we can talk about in upcoming meetings about other ways to guarantee that we handle the potential incoming Crocker enrollment to kindergarten in a way where we don't need to change the enrollment zones. Look forward to those discussions, but it's because of the future unknowns that we're still working out that we can't be making such a monumental decision. And I kind of look at rezoning as one of the most disruptive actions a school committee can take, but it sometimes it's a necessary evil. Like I remember back in the when we closed Marks Meadow a decade ago, and I was here as a parent, and my kids weren't even changing schools, and that was an incredibly disruptive time. I can only imagine what that experience was like for parents that were shifting schools. So it's never anything we want to do, but even the ED percent imbalance aside, just the fact of running out of space at Crocker is going to force our hand to look at this. But the big future things that we don't know, to me the biggest factor is regionalization. So, I mean, I just follow these details a little more closely because I'm the chair of the Regionalization Planning Board. But there's two big factors that could alter the equation of how we weigh certain variables here. Well, one is just simply zoning the kids that go to Pelham Elementary right now. Those kids would, if we regionalize with Pelham, they would be part of our region. And so where would those kids go? Where would Amherst residents that live near that building potentially go, right? So that's a variable that if we're trying to look at something that we don't want to change for at least a decade, new enrollment zone lines, that would be one variable. The other variable that's interesting, and we're just starting to explore this idea on the board, so this is just a preliminary idea, but in a region, you have your transportation reimbursed. Now, it's supposed to be 100% from the state. You know, Mr. Donias and I know very well from speaking and advocating with other regional schools that it's not funded at 100% by the state. It's subject to the legislature. This past year, it was 70-something%. It's going to be 80% next year. And so if we're looking at some options that are maybe cost prohibitive because of the transportation costs, it maybe changes our thinking if we're getting reimbursed for 80% of that transportation, right? But we're not going to know that until regionalization itself plays out. And then we had Mr. McPherson talking about the future of our buildings. That's a discussion that I really want to dig into as much as we can. I don't imagine that in the very near term we're going to get to a definitive absolute mark of like, okay, by this date then you're going to have X number of buildings, but it would be good if we're going to try and map something out that's going to last for a decade plus if we had a better idea of how many elementary buildings are we going to have to maintain. So for that reason, I'm comfortable with putting this off, but we still have that kind of unsolved problem of Crocker enrollment that, you know, is like we said, we're going to be addressing going forward.
And just one comment on regional transportation. So I just trying to think of whether to say this or not. So I'm not going to go into the weeds, but I think there's 2 towns involved in regional transportation, and how that cost sharing goes is obviously not defined. Your group's not at that place, and as we know from our 7 through 12 region, it changes year to year. So I just would like to be cautious about thinking about how potential savings would be utilized, because I'm in a funny place in terms of working for both districts, and the motivations that may go involved in regionalization. I think I don't want to go too forward from my own vantage point. I'm not advising anyone else of talking about that funding going to anything in particular, because I just think that would be a conversation for a new region to have, not necessarily part of that. So that's my 2 cents. Anything else on option 2 or? Okay. So option 3. So again, blue for Dusty, Marla. Blue underlined, much like the previous map. This one is just for illustrative purposes. This is not a map that is defining new boundaries. There's no new maps presented tonight that are binding in any sort of way.
Not being proposed.
No.
Just purely conceptual.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. And so option 3 is a full lottery with 2 enrollment zones. And this is, frankly, when I've looked at other districts, option 1 and option 3 are the 2 most common options. So 1 is where a school becomes fully based on lottery. Magnet school means something in Massachusetts it doesn't mean in other states, but oftentimes you'll hear magnet schools, referred to in this way, where there's not a catchment area, it's fully by lottery. Cambridge, for instance, has no catchment area for Amigo School, one of the schools I visit. It's completely by lottery. And so the idea of this is that you can divide the town in 2 enrollment zones, Crocker Farm and Wildwood. Fort River would become a district school of choice. It's a recycled map from a couple years ago. We're looking at what are the potential ways to have 2 enrollment zones in a town that balance socioeconomic equity. I didn't even do the work, and I can, depending what you all decide to ask me to do. of looking at this 2 years later and would those numbers actually sort of still make sense, although I don't think the shifts have been so dramatic that they would, but I just wanted to show that we could come up with a map that has 2 enrollment zones and then a lottery system. So as opposed to option 2, I think option 3 does have some real benefits. I mean, the capacity matching, right? There's, people, I don't know a better way to say it, but we can manufacture the right capacity for the school 100% of the time because we're controlling the enrollments. Fairness, so there's no geographic or residential housing pattern that influences who gets into the dual language program. We also could quote unquote manufacture the right number of language models in the program quite easily. The program model, and this has come up in the committee's discussions, we wouldn't need a monolingual English classroom, and if there's interest to create a larger program, this is one way that we potentially could do that. And we could certainly put a socioeconomic diversity, if the committee was interested, as a factor in that lottery as well. Again, the ability to control who goes to which school, what Cambridge does, is at the highest, at its apex in this model. In my opinion, those are all really valuable advantages, but there's also some cautions. The phasing would be very, very painful, both either fiscally, for families and students, because you're essentially saying a school community that has existed since 1973 doesn't really exist anymore, in a different way than any of the other options. The transportation cost time on buses, you'd have a significant increase in that. There's, I think the capacity, I talked about this a little bit with transportation folks this morning, to do the model we talked about for option 1, but if we're doing it to populate the whole school, we can't have buses making 2 stops for, over time, 300 some odd students, right? It's just not feasible. We really have to have lots of buses going multiple directions. In a place like Cambridge and their population density, that's a little more doable, where a lot of people actually take alternate means to get to the school. Amherst is very different population density than a place like Cambridge, so it's a little less practical or more expensive, depending on the way you want to think about it. Third point is something as a former Fort River teacher, former Fort River student that we have here, it's a loss of identity.
And a Fort River parent.
Yeah, there you go. And that's something that is really important. It's important to me. It may not be an overriding factor, but it's as opposed to a transition where the school is sort of morphing into something gradually over time. It's really shifting that dynamic, and the lottery factors would again be more complicated because you'd actually really have to balance out Wildwood and Crocker Farm in even much more of a way because the scale is so much different than option 1. So the way I think of option 3 is the benefits are very strong, but the cautions are very strong as well, or I have very strong cautions about it. So the transportation piece, certainly if we want to do this work, we could do it, but just even by quick conversation, not quick, but it wasn't a deep dive of hours and hours this morning, just having that many buses go to that many, multiple of the same locations to go to different sites. We see it in the simulation we did this morning was with the specialized programs, which are relatively small, and how much time and energy and effort goes into just transporting students to 3 programs located in 2 schools, and the end size on that is drastically lower than we're talking about populating the entire school. So that would be daunting both fiscally and logistically. The phasing, and how could you do that over time is another large variable. And the cohort size, right? So we've talked about 2, 4, could you do 3? Sort of everyone tells me 3 is not a good idea. Asking anyone to teach bilingually meaning half the day in English, half the day in Spanish is an incredibly large ask of any individual, no matter how bilingual they are, because being bilingual and teaching bilingually are 2 incredibly different things. But that's certainly a conversation that could be had. So I'll stop there because I'm going to go on to option 4, which is new to you.
Any questions from the committee? Comments?
Just in the spirit of completely just doing thought experiments and not proposing anything, but I'm just thinking with this one, potentially you could choose any of the 3 schools to then be that magnet school. Is there a reason, if it's freeing us up from all of these new constraints? I mean, you could potentially, the one building that we're pretty sure we're not going to be fully renovating, right, or doing anything major, and would be Crocker Farm. I mean, just total thought experiment. Yeah. You could potentially move it to make Crocker Farm the magnet school
Yeah.
and have the other two be the ones that would potentially be the two zones. I mean, geographically, it's a little weirder, but I don't know. Is that
So I think there'd be
True.
two things. Yeah, geographically, I was going to go back to a slide before,
Yeah.
but I think it's on the page. If you look at that first, option one had that first map, and so Fort River is relatively central. I mean, it's a little further east, but all the buildings are a little bit east. It's not as like over past Amherst College on the other side of it, or someplace that far west. It's the most centrally located. I also think, to be very practical, I'm not saying anything that people don't say on the soccer sidelines, right? Quaker Farm right now has a reputation because it has walls and there aren't other concerns about the infrastructure, so putting a desirable program in the building that already is the most desirable from an infrastructure point of view, I have concerns about how that would be experienced by the community.
Yeah, no, that makes, this is why.
So- No, absolutely, and I
All of
appreciate
this.
the question. The idea of this is that we dig in
Yeah.
and we come from an inquiry approach. None of that was
Yeah,
intended to be.
Mr. Nafferty?
So we talked about this, I can't remember what was filmed and what wasn't over the summer in our meetings. I'm just sort of saying this also because we talked about this a lot over the summer, that this seemed like a potentially intriguing idea and even useful idea down the road, and something that I hadn't thought about, I at least hadn't thought about over the summer, that, it's still summer, right? It really is still summer. Anyways, that I hadn't thought about until now, was that I don't even know if you'd get enough families, voluntarily joining the lottery to fill an entire elementary school, right? I mean, so this is something where, and especially also, I think there's a rational element to people might get more excited about this program after it's up and running and after, the kinks are worked out, and after they see it, going really well. And so you could imagine down the road, I mean, you could even conceptually, you could imagine down the road having more than one dual language or other, you'll get to this, I know,
Yeah.
highly programmed and specialized elementary school. It's like a cool idea. But in an initial phase, not only would it be profoundly disruptive at a point where you're just trying to do the program well, whatever that means, but unless you're actually going to start going to families and saying, I know you didn't volunteer to go to Fort River, but I'm afraid you're going to have to, I'm not even sure it's a practical idea initially.
Yeah, and I think what we find, Cambridge being a good example, they started as a school, sort of what I'm proposing as a preferred option, where they had a monolingual classroom, had an enrollment zone, and over time it shifted where 35 years in, right, and Barbary was the same. In Framingham they started in this model, and 20 years in, they said, you know what, I think we have enough support, and now they're at a place where they're expanding. But those are generations of work, and the other thing to note is every program, and we heard this literally from every program, Amigos down to Princeton, which is kind of a newbie, said, we're always adjusting our program over time, right? And that's true of our monolingual English schools too. Otherwise, right, we would have a lot more time on our hands if we weren't trying to improve the educational experience of our students. The same is true in a dual language program as it is in a monolingual English school. So option 4 came up as a conversation at the last school committee meeting, which is no changes to enrollment policies, increase Fort River to 3 classes per grade level, same way, but instead of filling with any lottery system that was intra-district, filling with our school choice program, which we've had in place for quite a few years now, and we have a long wait list. So this year we accepted 12 of 33 applications. So there's a lot of demand for school choice, more than what we're able to meet, and so it would just fill the vacancies in the dual language program with choice demand. So again, advantage, least amount of change, right? There's I have to acknowledge that is an advantage. Sometimes can you get the program up and running with the least amount of other things attached to it? This would do that. There's some financial benefit, right? The students who would come each come with $5,000 plus an increment if they have special needs. So it would be financially beneficial, and the phasing would be non-existent, right? It would just there is no phasing, it just happens. The cautions, and I think the first one's the most significant one, is that I think many Amherst residents would feel that this was gravely unfair, that they're paying taxes in the community. We've historically used choice to fill out seats that were not filled by resident students. That's been our clear philosophy, is that we're not trying to increase the number of sections. When we have vacant seats, what we consider vacant seats in classrooms, it benefits Amherst resident students because financially it means we have a full complement of specials teachers, and we have all the other things that our families feel passionate about. And it doesn't, other than filling vacant seats, it doesn't have other impacts on Amherst resident students. So I think for all the advantages, the first caution for me, I think it ends the conversation from my vantage point, because I think I agree with the feelings, the cautions that people would have. That the fact that you could move to Hadley and perhaps have a better chance of getting in a dual language program than if you lived in Orchard Valley, I think on its face will just feel unfair to people. And I think it is unfair in some ways. So I'm open to, more dialogue and questions. This is the end of the slides that's focused on the zoning, and then I'll get more into other ongoing work that's more in the academic programs. I'm sorry this is lengthy, but there's a lot of content.
Any other questions, comments? Okay, so I guess, Dr. Morris, this is, it's a great presentation, and I agree it's lengthy, but it's definitely important. I think next time, though, we should probably make an adjustment to the agenda just to reflect the length so that the expectations are there.
Or I'll talk faster.
I guess my question is really just about what comes next, right?
Sure.
So you mentioned, work ongoing, and we've had that conversation multiple times. What does the timeline look like for coming back to the committee with sort of the next step, the next iteration for us to consider?
Sure. So I think two key dates for me that will lead to our September 25th meeting, next meeting of this body. Excuse me. So one is that we're continuing to do work. We've been meeting on Monday next week with the group that did Licensure. And the key implication, they're not talking about zoning, but they are talking about the academic program and what's the right number, right? And trying to get a little more clarity. I talked about a minimum. We may have a minimum and a desired, and do we want to split it like Wyndham does with proficient Spanish speakers, students with Spanish background, perhaps not proficiency. So we need to do some more work on that. We did quite a bit, but we didn't get to a finality point on that. And then before we meet next, I'll also be traveling to Harrisonburg, which is, I've described a couple times, but it's a district with now 5 of the 6 schools having dual language programs. They started in 2010, and both about enrollment zones and about how did they move from where they are in 2010 to where they are in 2018, and what's their experience and what would they do differently. And it's the same kind of questions we ask every school when we visit. There's also some work that teachers are doing. There's a workshop in Holyoke next week, so some of the teachers who are at La Siembra are going, and it's much more on the academic program side. I think it's next Wednesday or Thursday. Holyoke has a dual language school they started a couple years ago, and so it's not just Holyoke, that's just a site where Mave is hosting a conference. So there's a lot of work that's going to happen in the next month, so what I hope to do is come back at the September 25th meeting with more clarity on the instructional side, which I think you need to be considering these. I don't think it'd be a surprise that option 1 is the one that I'd be recommending at this point in time, and I'm not looking for, I'm open to response, but I want to get more clarity and come back with more information before I make that more formally. But I do think when you look at the benefits and the cautions, that's the one that has the best match. I agree with Mr. Demling, none of these are going to be perfect or resolve all problems, but after spending Thursday and Friday with that group working on this, I'm really thinking about the instructional program. And one comment that was made last time, which I thought was really important, I think Carrie made it, was, Allison, Ms. McDonald made it, was just, can we think about the first couple years, right? And what do we need? What's the right model for the first couple of years to get the academic program up and running, knowing that we're going to be constantly reevaluating how things are going and how to improve things. And for me, when I think about the 4 options, option 1 offers the most advantages in getting things off the ground and letting teachers do the work they need to do without an overlay of other significant systematic changes that I think will complicate the first couple, the takeoff, which is how I'm viewing fall 2019 is the takeoff. And I think the things, so that's where I'm at, and that's the things that we're doing the next month before we come back.
Okay. Any other final thoughts or comments?
Can I ask a question?
Sure, Mr. Nakajima.
How's the staff feeling about this? People excited?
Yeah, I thought it was really, right, so you think of goals of a 2-day retreat, and one of my goals was, I hope people are both like excited and daunting, feeling like this is a daunting thing because they want to do it well and excited. And I think on that account, the La Siembra worked really, La Siembra means planting or sowing would be the translation. So the idea wasn't that you got to, we've got it all figured out. And so that's really hard for teachers who, wonderfully in this district, are incredibly perfectionist. They care deeply about their work. And for us to leave, and I'll get into this in a couple minutes, feel like, yeah, we made progress on these fronts, but nothing is done, right? It took some cognitive dissonance to know, and the trainers were great in saying this is where you should be. Like, all these things are interdependent, so you don't want to finish anything too soon because you're going to go back and say, oh, we didn't think of how these things interconnect. But the level of enthusiasm I felt was high. The level of concern was, frankly, we had an honest conversation. What does the school committee need to have in place in the fall to support this moving forward, and can we meet that standard? And that wasn't a negative comment towards school committee. It was just, we have so many things to do, and then me reminding them we also have next summer. So if this moves forward, yes, we want to work during the school year, and we're stipending people to be doing that ongoing work and developing schedules around that. But what both presenters said is the reason you do this much work this summer, and you ask for this much time ahead to have committee, elected official support, is they can do the work through the year, and then next summer you're not like, oh my God, we need to get it going. You knew you were going on that way. You can work in the winter and spring along that, and you spend a lot of time the summer before, both in the community engagement. I mean, you're doing community engagement. Part of what you're doing is a community engaging piece throughout, but throughout the process. But to really know that there's time the summer before to work out those last-minute details that are numerous when you're talking about a change this large is critically important. But sorry, again, long-winded answer. I'll try to get more succinct.
Thank you. And I noticed there was a member from the community that had their hand up, and I'm just going to ask, I want to move the agenda forward, but if there are any questions from the community, just to please feel free to email either the chair or Dr. Morris or the entire committee, and we try our best to answer those. Okay?
Yep. So related ongoing work, so the Special Education Specialized Program Working Group, they met 4 times in July. I sat in on 2 of those 4, not all of those 2 sessions. And meeting again with them on Thursday, as I mentioned, what's really neat is that 2 of the members of that group were also participants in La Siembra. So they're starting to see the interplay between what a dual language program implementation might mean for specialized programs. And so it's really important for me because I don't want to be part of my role is to be the communicator and hold all these things, but part of it is that they both, 2 members have had the direct experience in both groups. So we're meeting on Thursday. By September, we'll have a little more clarity on the directions they would recommend. La Siembra I'll get into in a second. The last 2 days, Kristen Rodriguez, who led the enrollment working groups, was back. We had representative groups of parents, staff members, and principals from, actually Pelham was included as well, I'll just mention that in the spirit of regionalization discussions. And 2 full days of programmatic identity work. And I think what's critical to talk about is 2 things. One is that this is based on identifying what needs there are in the school, not things that would seem cool or we'd like to do. It gets back to your question about why are we doing a dual language program, right? And so on the same token, we're doing the same type of work at Wildwood and at Crocker Farm. And similar to dual language, it's going to be a year-long study where the goal is for all 3 of the schools to have really defined plans that are presented to the community, to you all in the spring. So there's going to be different edges to each of them and different topics that they're going to focus on, but all of them we'll have mission statements, all of them based on data and what the needs in the community are and how to fill them. So identity, I think, can be, we're using that word, but it's really broader than identity. It's really a future direction of the schools, which is, identity is part of it, but it's broader than that. So, we didn't look at a list of 5 things that'd be neat and pick one. It was really looking at a data review. What data do we have on our student experience, our teacher experience? Engaging in protocols about what data do we, one of the things one of the schools was interested in is they really wanted to focus on student engagement and how would we know how students are experiencing our school. We don't have data on that in a codified way, and how do you get that from young children, right? So that's the types of conversations we're having. It's not like this would be a neat logo or stamp to have in our school, this will attract students. I mean, hopefully we get there at the end of how to communicate, but it's really coming from a place of a needs inventory and deeply appreciative of the staff, but particularly the families and community members who gave up 2 days of their summer to be working on, really heady, protocol-based work, and more work to come on that. Fort Reed's feasibility study is ongoing. That's on the agenda, so I'm not going to talk about that right now, but obviously there's a connection between that and what we're talking about, and regionalization is also on the agenda, so I won't talk about that. So I was trying to think, because I knew I'd run long, what's one slide that I could just show the types of things we were doing? It's not a very impressive slide, but these were the types of documents and protocols we were doing in La Siembra, and to try to identify what are the equity and cross-cultural goals, right? So obviously we have the academic program, but what we heard from everywhere we go, everyone who's been in a program, is that the level, the experience is substantially different for all students, not just students who come in speaking Spanish, because of the empathy that's grown, because of the fact that it flips the table in terms of a social dynamic in the United States anyway, of what it means to be an English speaker and a Spanish speaker, and the power dynamics that are sadly still part of our country. And how does it connect to our larger goals around social justice? There's a whole slice that we spent a significant amount of time. We talked about teachers and support staff. Who are the right teachers to be in the right places? How do we think through a multi-year implementation of the teachers without, people are going to want to move sometimes, right? We can't lock people into multi-year contracts, but we really wanted to think through who's on our staff and who could participate. Parent community support was another whole strand. How do we get parents interested? Again, to my point earlier, while many families may be enthusiastic about the concept, they're going to have as they should, a lot of questions about the implementation. What is this going to mean for my child? How am I going to be able to help my child with homework when they're in 3rd grade? How am I going to be able to read books with my child? I don't speak Spanish at home. Going back to the first point, but someone says invariably is, oh, that's the experience of ELL students right now. Right? Every ELL student and family has those challenges. What's different is it's monolingual English-speaking families who are encountering it for the first time and with a level of privilege, and I don't mean that pejoratively, that's the reality, I have it, right? And with a level of privilege that the language of instruction is going to be my primary language. And so to flip that, it can be really daunting for families. And how do we get families on board to know that what kindergarten classrooms look like, to trust that your students will learn Spanish and English, that it's not going to stunt development in English. Really logical, good questions that there's thankfully incredible amount of research on to answer, but how do we engage families early in the process? And not for the sake of a lottery or getting more students in, but because to do this well, we need parents to be supported. How do we integrate the dual language program in the whole school? We know that there'll be 2 of, whatever it is, or, if this flies, 2 of 15 or 16 classrooms at Fort River will be dual language classrooms in the fall of 2019, and 14 of 16 won't. So what does that mean, and how does every student and every classroom, while not in a dual language program, how does it connect to the social justice missions of the school and infuse the school, and how do you play that out over a 7-year implementation, which is atypical for most changes? The student population piece I've talked a lot about, but again, getting more clear on that, and what levels of administrative support are needed for the program to be a success, who owns the different aspects of the program. Katie Richardson, who you've met, who was the ELL coordinator, was there. I was present. Jim Sheehan wasn't able to be, but Diane Chamberlain was the principal, was there. We had special ed teachers, ELL teachers, classroom teachers, specialist teachers, and all of them are looking for who does what when. And the specialist teachers, a great conversation. How do specialist teachers weave into a dual language program? And we do have some specialist teachers who are bilingual at Fort River, and what does that mean for the specialist program? And all that falls under administrative support, who's making which decisions. So this is just a slice of the work, but all of these you could see if you're familiar with Google products or Google Docs, because they're all documents that codify the work and to know that the work is ongoing, right? So we did not complete any of these, we did more than this, but we didn't complete any of these documents. This comes from a national protocol from MABE's parent organization about how to plan for dual language implementation. This wasn't just we came up with these. These are defined things, but you could see that there's an interconnection between all 6 of these, and that's why the daunting thing at the end is, what does the school committee need to know? Because we're not going to be done with all of these in a way that they'd feel comfortable mid-fall. So that's why we're breaking down to what are the things that we need to prioritize to have done earlier for you all in the community to feel comfortable. and what are things that we can develop over the winter and spring and even summer months next year. So it was an exciting 2 days. The highlight, I think, for everyone is one of the teachers, current teachers at the Barbary School in Framingham, came and taught a first grade lesson completely in Spanish. So there's 13 of us there, 2 native Spanish speakers, 2 or 3 of us that like have a survival level of Spanish, and and that's like a term, like I can survive in situations with my level of Spanish if people are patient with me, and then the rest totally monolingual, don't have any Spanish background. And so it was a first grade lesson, we're adults, but there was no English used for the entirety of the lesson. And what was really captivating was how we saw the teaching pedagogy that has to go along with that, which is not wildly different than what we see in English, but it is different because it's really much more of an ELL based, it very much matches what we do in English for ELL teachers. And we talked about sheltered English, which we've done a lot of work on in the last 5 years, and how important the sheltering piece is. But it also got it, people were really anxious, myself included, at the beginning of the lesson, because there was no ambiguity about the expectation of participation. There was zero ambiguity. And the level of support and guidance and sheltering, which is a technical term of how to support students who are acquiring a language, was such that everybody at the end was speaking Spanish, the visual supports were there, we were all participating, and you could just feel the anxiety like seeping out of us in a positive way as the 20-minute lesson took place. But I think it was a hallmark moment for our staff to experience what it feels like. And one of the interesting questions the presenters asked, first of the native Spanish speakers who are fully bilingual, was, what did it feel like you to be in a Spanish classroom? It's been a long time since you were in a Spanish classroom. And they talked about the huge impact it made on them as adults, and they knew, there was everyone knew what was happening. It wasn't like you were a 5-year-old and this is new, but just how it changed their behavior. Mm-hmm. Changed their feeling towards the content, to have it taught in their home language, which, again, just based on unfortunate society realities, is not often valued in the same way that English is. And it also, then they asked the question to the English speakers, how did it feel to be being taught in a language that you don't know? And our responses were good. So, it were interesting. So both on the academic level, but also on the kind of social, emotional, interpersonal level, how that worked was interesting. One of the staff members who's bilingual is new to the school. Was hired literally, I think signed the contract the day before, right? And for her to then to quickly be flipped in a place where she was the resource, we're like, and we were like, no, we can't speak English, we have to speak Spanish, and have that. It was interesting how quick that flip go. We have all these veteran teachers, and we have someone who literally is hired the day before, and they're the expert. And how we could extrapolate from that, what does it feel like to be a child in our district? Despite all the social justice things and all the things we do, it was incredibly powerful, and that's why we want to do more site visits. And North Wyndham's not that far; it's like an hour and 20 minutes. And since they have a program model similar to what we sort of made a commitment to the 50-50 model. Also, that's something that's worth noting. We're looking at site visits for fall for the staff as well, not for the administrative reasons that I've been taking some of the visits, but much more on the practical side of things.
And just one comment on that. I think last academic year we had talked about having a school committee member go,
Yeah.
and if I remember correctly, I was that person that was going to go.
Oh, that's right.
And then that meeting fell through. I think it was weather related or something.
Faux weather related, yeah. It was supposed to snow, it didn't snow, but everyone had a snow day. Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah.
So maybe if there's still an opportunity to have, it doesn't have to be me, but it can be anyone on the committee. To attend, I think it might be helpful, right?
It's
It's just, just what you've just described right now about the participant experience is an incredibly valuable experience for people to just be there in person and understand what that means. You're sitting in a classroom of, 5, 6, 7-year-olds, hearing what they hear throughout the day.
Yeah.
You can, I think, articulate and understand better really what's supposed to happen.
Absolutely. Yeah, we'll do.
Great. Okay, thank you. Any other questions or comments, or? Okay. Dr. Morris, thank you very much. It's,
Everything gets pushed back now.
It does,
You set your
exactly.
clock.
Thank you, Dr. Morris. We really appreciate that. Okay, Mr. Dunley?
Can I propose a 5-minute break? Would that be pushing the line?
Well, I think, that might be valuable, probably for most of us. Let's take a 5-minute break. So can I get a motion to take a break? Do this.
I move to take a break.
Okay, second?
Second.
All those in favor? Great, thank you. On recess for 5 minutes.
Thank you.
Okay, so with that, call meeting to order at 8:18. And just to close out our conversation around just thinking about dual language program, you know what that means. We've had a few conversations already about the need to bring the community along. Just a reminder to the committee that we have a column that we have worked out with the editor of the Amherst Bulletin. And I've actually reached out to Mr. Moulton to ask for, a date for when we might be able to submit our next column. We had thought about doing that, trying to time it for the beginning of school, because that's when people are kind of coming back from vacations, or, last August vacations. In any case, it looks like at this point, we may be able to get a column in either the 24th, which would mean finalizing something by the 20th, next Monday, which might be doable, but we'll see. Or if not, the week of the 27th, which would be, I guess, the 30th is the actual publication date, which is that Thursday. So either way, we will get it in for that timing, and we can definitely raise the question that we were just talking about during recess, which was making sure that we're getting the community enough advance notice about the big decisions that are coming up. And if they have questions, if they want to bring anything to us, to definitely do that, and plan on, on sort of tuning in during that.
Yeah, and I think the only thing I'll add is we'll part of the communication plan is outreach, as we've done, to preschool families, which isn't perfect, so I appreciate the thinking about the Amherst Bulletin and other media, earned media, right?
Earned media.
Yeah, there you go. Learning the lingo. Just because, our attempts are, I say imperfect because it's a hard population to, we've had some success, but it's a hard population. You're relying on lots of other people to allow you to communicate with their parent guardian population, which some places rightfully have concerns about. So we've had some success, but I think the more different venues that information is shared, the better off we are.
Absolutely. Great. Okay, so moving on, we are right on schedule. So the next item on the agenda is mysteriously titled Goals Discussion. And so I just wanted to shed a little light on that. So it comes from having the conversation that we had previously around making sure that there was some continuity of goals, right? Both for the district and also for the superintendent evaluation. And I think I had actually raised it at one point saying, there's goals and then there's goals, right? And like, how do we get to the bigger goals, and and what is it that we're actually trying to articulate, both at a district and school committee level, but also, impact for budget and for superintendent evaluation and all of that. So that's where this conversation came from. I had talked with Mike about thinking through what that might be, and I asked him, would you be interested in putting together, some initial thinking around some goals, and he, I think, rightfully reflected it back and said, why don't you take a shot at it and then share it with the committee and see where we are. And I say rightfully because I think that is something that is beneficial for us to have a conversation with at this level, and then bring that back to the superintendent, right? Because it has an impact in so many different ways, right? And thinking about, where have we come from and where do we want to go? And this is related to our, concerns around equity in other mission-driven decisions. But also thinking about curriculum and thinking about professional, staff development, all those different kinds of things, right? And I think now that we're in a position with stable leadership at the district, thanks to Dr. Morris and our esteemed committee, that we actually are in a good place to be able to kind of have that robust conversation, right, and really think about what that's going to mean at least in the next year. So I took the liberty of preparing a very short memo to the committee, and I'm not even sure if this is the correct format. And I apologize that I didn't share that with the committee ahead of time, but just vacations and everything that's been going on, it became a little difficult. I did make extra copies, and I will read it out loud for members of the public and the community. And with your indulgence, we'll read it fairly quickly. I think we can get through it quickly. But really the idea is just to kind of jumpstart a conversation. So it's by no means intended to be the end-all and be-all, but really just, did everybody get a copy? Okay, that's a copy. And we can make this available for members of the community later as well, along with our meeting minutes. So just read it very quickly. So we have an opportunity this year with stable leadership in the district to establish continuity in our goals for our superintendent and the district. As we begin to think about where we want the district to go next year and beyond, it's important to reflect on our successes and challenges to date and incorporate those learnings into our future district planning and budgeting processes. According to DESE, quote, the school committee in its big picture oversight role is best positioned to safeguard the district's focus by monitoring goal coherence in the midst of what can otherwise become a proliferation of district goals and strategies. Effective district planning and execution is built on a clear, consistent, shared, and achievable vision for the district and its future. 3 to 5 strategic objectives, the key levers for improvement, are recommended to support district focus. Any school committee overarching goals, superintendent evaluation goals, district budget goals, and school improvement plan goals must be fully aligned with the strategic objectives and outcomes of the district plan, the district's official roadmap for improvement. These district goal-setting documents should be monitored and updated as necessary to ensure coherence and reflect the district's current realities and priorities. Planning for improvement is a continuous process, and the district plan is a living document that should reflect that process. Now, we have had, just a quick introduction here, we've had a previous district plan that was in effect a number of years ago. So this is referring to what that would be, but we're sort of in a different position at this point. So anyway, below are a series of initial ideas about continuity for discussion and reflection among the committee so that we can provide guidance to the superintendent on next year's evaluation goals and budget priorities. My only intention in sharing these ideas in this memo is to jumpstart a critical conversation and help us get on a path for progress. Our committee has expressed in various ways during these past few months an interest in having clearly identified district priorities moving forward, and it is my hope that this memo can help us eventually get to a place where we have a district plan that is in alignment with our educators' curriculum goals and our community's values. For discussion and additional input, here are a few initial ideas. Meeting district's equity mission and diverse learners' needs. We need leadership to honestly assess how well we're doing with our growing diverse young student population, specifically in how we are addressing their needs, and to establish a plan to work towards improvement. This goal could be tied to enrollment, professional development, family engagement, student performance, and several other elements from the superintendent rubric of standards and indicators. Continuous curriculum improvement. Building upon the homework guidelines revision last year, review and share areas for further curriculum improvement based on collaboration and feedback from schools, educators, and administrators. Implement a qualitative data collection protocol to capture the effects of recent changes to guidelines and policies, recommend a plan for adjustments as needed, and begin to execute against it. Third, building on enrollment working group recommendations. How are we addressing preschool needs in the coming year? What does enrollment look like across the district in terms of socioeconomic balance, special needs, etc. this year and in the next 5 years? What will dual language programming look like, and how will all our schools be incorporated into a comprehensive plan for improving school experiences for all students? Fourth, capital improvements across the district. We have aging buildings and limited resources. There has been a stated need to make improvements as we can and our budgets allow, but what is the proposed path forward to ensure that our schools are the best educational environments they can be? Our students and educators benefit from a plan directed by the superintendent and the school committee to carry out specific projects that include improving air quality and circulation, creating engaging learning environments, improving landscaping and physical exteriors of buildings, and ensuring all students have access to technologically rich classrooms that reflect 21st century learning. There are likely other goals and/or issues that we'd like to address as a body, but in all considerations, we want to aim for a process that allows us to create specific, measurable, and actionable goals. I'm hopeful that this memo will result in a robust response from the school committee and superintendent, followed by a process that we can agree to that allows us to develop quality district goals and budget priorities for the upcoming year. So this isn't something that I've shared with Dr. Morris before. This is the very first time that all of you are seeing this simultaneously. And again, I think, it's really just an attempt to try to get the ball rolling. But, I'm open to thoughts, questions, comments, and even an idea of what a process might look like, right? I know that, given our previous year's goal-setting process and budgeting process, this is sort of right in the place where we want to be in thinking about this, right? And so I'm hoping that as the committee starts to move forward during the next few weeks, that we can build on this, maybe use some of this, I don't know, to establish a framework, if you will, for both developing a district plan, but also maybe thinking about, other questions in relation to that. So I'm going to stop talking right now and just turn it over to anyone who wants to raise anything.
I'll defer. There's a committee member.
So just some general thoughts. Thank you for doing this. I think any goal process, whether it's superintendent evaluation or other level, benefits from conscious and proactive thinking, which this certainly is, and it's middle of August, which is pretty much the earliest we can be starting this. So I think the timing is right. The emphasis on the district plan is interesting because just from my own personal qualitative experience, having been on the committee for a year and a half, that's had almost no importance in the impact of at least what we do. So bringing that back into prominence and leveraging that as a resource seems advisable. So going down the sort of suggestions of topics to focus on, I mean, they all seem like good suggestions. Like the one sort of overarching thing I'm always thinking about is just preserving and protecting the budget, which is like not really exciting goal, but it's like the oxygen that funds everything. And so I always just sort of, and that's a common thread throughout all these different things, depending on how you look at it. And on a directly related note to preserving and expanding the budget is that kind of communications and marketing thing, this sort of new role that schools have in a quote-unquote competitive marketplace to be more proactive in describing what we have available. I guess one of the challenges I always have in terms of turning something like this into a practical, actionable thing is that because so much of it is so general and abstract, high idea, but tying it down to a specific thing in a timely manner is to me the biggest challenge. Like, in one sense, the school year has already begun, and so I think like the first practical question I have is, okay, by when would we want to have these goals, the specific goals, done and completed? Because if we're still talking about specific goals in November or December, it becomes less. It's that A in SMART goals, achievable. To then hand it over to the superintendent and say, okay, achieve these goals, even though we're 30 or 40% of the way through the year. But I like this as a general approach.
Dr. Morris?
Yeah, I think, first of all, I really appreciate your thinking and your work on this. And I agree with there's nothing I don't agree with on here. I think the one thing that for me is missing is I think about my goals for the year, and the district's goals for the year, which are not always the same thing, but I think in this case do match, is really having robust improvement plan, multi-year improvement plans for each of the elementary schools moving forward. As a real goal for the, with achievable date and deadline and all three schools I mentioned earlier, having, spring as that coming to the committee, probably post-budget, just practically, it probably makes sense to do that. But what we haven't had at the elementary level, this gets at some of the first page of what you created, is a multi-year plan of improvement, and that's what each in their own way, all three of the elementary schools are going to be the focus. One of the teachers said, are we going to do this and other things? And I said, yeah, the reality is there's always a balance of things. We're not going to not do social justice work, right? And everyone nodded their heads, and you knew that. But are we introducing 12 new curriculums this year? We're not, right? We really want to be thoughtful, and to preview, one of the things I'm going to say at convocation is that we want all staff members, and certainly it's true for the community as well, we want people truly engaged in the planning process this year. That at the end of this year, we're going to have a plan, and we're going to make adjustments over time, but we're going to have a plan moving forward. And for people who haven't had just to be very blunt about it, a permanent superintendent in a couple of years. That's no one's fault, it's just the reality. This is really a year to dig in and really define how our school is going to improve, and not just improve for the 2019-2020 school year, but for the couple of school years after that. There's a coherence and a plan that is a multi-year plan that's based on data and provides a real roadmap for what our schools are going to become, right? So when I think about, like, if you ask me just casually, like, what's the number one thing in your mind about the elementary schools this year, that would be the number one thing. Whether that is realized in a goal or how that's realized, I think, I don't have complete clarity on, and I know it's addressed in some ways here, but I wanted to put a finer point on it that when I think about my leadership and our collaborative work as educators, certainly there's a lot of these things that we're going to be doing this year, right? We're going to be continuing the equity work that we started last year and doing work on hiring. Like, none of that is to say we're just only doing planning, but to truly do the type of planning and deep dive that we need to do, that's going to take a lot of time, energy, and resources, and I believe it's worth it to actually have a coherence moving forward. But that's going to take a lot of our bandwidth.
Mr. Nakajima?
So, I think this is a valuable memo and valuable exercise. I think what's interesting about our district and on the elementary level is that we have had more clearly defined challenges that are still large enough in scope and scale that they start feeling strategic, right? Because it's like a big thing. How do we want to organize our schools? How do we have a real program? What do we do with socioeconomic inequities between the different schools? And they are, in that sense. And I think what we've been able to do over the last year and a half is we've been able to, I'm speaking very selfishly, I've only been here a little over a year and a half, that we've been able to act with a level of coherence at the elementary level that has been a substitute for actually having an honest-to-goodness district plan, and I think that, so it's been, in my view, it's been less problematic at the elementary level than it is at the secondary level. I think at the secondary level, it's actually, despite all the good things our schools do, I actually think it's massively problematic that we have no direction. You know what I mean? No codified direction at the secondary level, and despite all the good work that's done. And so I think it needs to be a really high priority. I think the interesting challenge we have this year, which to me this memo sort of illustrates, is we need to start acting like we have a plan, and setting out, like, not just being run by, and I'm not putting down whatever goals you set, but not just running by whatever goals you set, or things we hear from the community, or things that are going on, where we suddenly say, like, hey, we gotta talk about this.
Right.
And everything is always important, right? It's always important. But the reality is, it's not strategic, and I'm gonna get to another point in 2 seconds on that. But so, the challenge, but also the challenge is, we wouldn't want, and I'm sure you don't intend this, you wouldn't want to put something in place that was so clear and structured that it forestalled the level of community engagement and staff engagement you want to have around developing an honest-to-God multi-year plan in which there's much more rich participation around setting those goals and establishing them. And of course, even when doing that, and I think you're trying to do this in here is that even if we did, it's not like all these subgroups and topics we've been working on go away, right? I mean, it is a fact that we'd be building on the enrollment working group work. It's a fact we'd be dealing with, building facilities-related issues and other things. Regionalization, is going to be an issue. So figuring out what the framework is that allows us to establish some sort of milestones or guideposts to our work that gives structure and coherence to the work of the committee this year is really important. Doing that in a way that it's sensitive to the fact that we actually need more structure around what we're going to be doing for this coming year, to have an output at the end of it that would then help us get even further toward that goal of having a multi-year district plan, and doing it in a way that continues to bring the community and the staff along with us in this process, not to even speak of the fact that there'll be a new town council somewhere in there, and they're undoubtedly going to have opinions about education. And then further is another thing that I want to bring up, because I think it's not one of the on 4 goals here, but it's one that I think about. And I said this to you earlier, Dr. Morris, I don't say privately, but just sort of like we talked about it one-on-one, it wasn't confidential, is I don't know how we set district goals as well as a goal for you that talks to what sort of continuous improvement or learning there is around sort of management and operations. But I would like to get more insight into that so that we actually have a running dialogue, and I don't mean micromanaging. So this is why I'm saying, I'm looking to you to figure out how to do this, because I want some ongoing and regularly interactive dialogue with the school committee, and really in this case, I mean both school committees, what we're talking about here. But without it being micromanaging, but with us giving us operational insight into how we're doing and how we need to be meta. How do we know what we're doing, right? And that's a systems issue, because ultimately you're just one person, right? So it has to be a system around how we engage with people. And I'll give the reason I think that's important is because it actually informs everything else down here, right? Everything else down here is informed with it. I mean, just even looking at it, my guess is if you don't know now, some point early in the year, you're going to have insight into predictable staff turnover that'll occur between now and next year. So we can when we're thinking about staff development goals, we're thinking about diversity recruitment and that whole mission. There is in fact an operational element to actually tracking and understanding where people are. Where are they going to be? We talked a huge amount about professional development and licensure earlier this year, and we know it plays in there too, right? Like where are there opportunities for professional development of current staff that look at a multi-year staff development sort of plans or concepts, and how are those developed? And so again, because I realize what I'm saying starts bleeding heavily over into actual management as opposed to talking about management. That's why I look to you for guidance on it, because I don't want to get into a position where the committee is identifying a role for itself that feels too sort of tactical and in the weeds. But I think we know that we have to be more engaged in that dialogue than we are now, or have been.
So I would echo what everybody says. Thank you for preparing this, and it's very thoughtful and a timely way to kickstart this overall process. So I appreciate that. That said, I'm feeling very unprepared because of the, as you called it, mysterious agenda item. Goals discussion could mean one of many, many, many other things. And being new on the committee and not having been through the goal setting process a year ago, I'm lacking the context of understanding sort of what is the timeline, what is the process, how does this fit in. I don't even want to respond to the specifics on it because I really have not had any time to really think about this. And I don't know how this discussion, this is a really big and strategic, meaty, important discussion. Not something that I'm really comfortable having on an ad hoc, let's react to a memo, as good as it is, kind of conversation. So my question, I guess, is what is the process, what is our timeline, and how do we, not necessarily how have we always gone about it, but how do we, really getting down to brass tacks and tactics of what do we want this process to look like and how we're going to have it. Because honestly, having all the great ideas that you guys are floating here is much more than a 20-minute conversation and could be a full 2-hour retreat in and of itself to really tackle a lot of these. So I'll just throw the question back out in terms of context and process.
Yeah. And just to clarify, this was not meant to become the goals necessarily that we would, what I wanted to highlight is exactly what you just raised, that we haven't really had a process for coming up with goals. So you're feeling unprepared. That's how we've all felt, I think, for a while now. Not to anyone's, not for anyone's fault. There's been a period of transition in, the district. that has impacted our ability to actually set goals for ourselves and to establish goals for the school committee, for the district, and then also for the superintendent. So the way that we've done this in the past couple of years has been that, the interim sort of acting, superintendent and then interim superintendent came to us and said, well, here's, kind of what we're working on right now, and I want to set some goals up for my evaluation. And those worked, fine, I think, for the immediate purpose, which was just to make sure that the train was moving forward and that we were doing the work that we're supposed to be doing, that the school committee was apprised of the work that was going on and had points to make evaluations upon. But it was not, in any sense of the way, a strategic, process, right? And it wasn't really, something that we could get buy-in from the community or anything like that. So this is an attempt to kickstart that conversation that you want to have, which I want to have as well, the meaty, big conversation, and not to the point of, weighing down everything else that's happening in the district, because I agree that there's work that needs to get done and we can't just spend all our time thinking about a planning process. But at the same time, we haven't had one in so long that this hopefully provides an opportunity for us to even think about what that planning process could look like. What do we want to have happen? What timeline do we want to establish? And I think we had, by necessity, had a very truncated goal-setting process in the past couple of years. And what that practically meant was that we were reviewing goals, in January or, February, which wasn't good for Dr. Morris, it wasn't good for us, So this is an attempt to try to move all of that back and start fresh. And we get to set the rules of how we want to move this forward. And I apologize, I should have probably given that context for our new members. You guys feel like you've been here for a while already, so forget that that's the case. But that's exactly where, you're 100% right. We should not be making decisions based on just a 20-minute presentation or a brief discussion. This has to be something that gets input from, multiple stakeholders, and that we spend some time with, because it is critically important. And I think I agree with Mr. Nakajima also that, we have a new form of government that's coming in. We want to be clear about what we want to accomplish, right? Because it's going to impact, the budgets that are set for us, our ability to be able to communicate to both our government and also our community about what we're trying to do here, right? And what we're trying to accomplish. And it's not just keep the train on the tracks anymore. Now it's, what's our vision for the future? Where do we want to go? So that's the genesis of this thinking, a conversation that I was having with Dr. Morris previously, and I'm really laying this at your feet to say, how you want to move forward with this. Is this something that you would like to do, over the course of several meetings? Do we want to schedule separate meetings to discuss? Is this something where Dr. Morris is going to want to have some impact on, or input on that? We want him to have it, and to think this through a little more carefully and with more time. So what does that look like, right? I have some thoughts, but I don't want to take that over. I think it really needs to be sort of a group discussion, right, and decision-making process.
Thank you, that's helpful.
Yeah, I think it would be great if we could take a big chunk of time. I know we're having a retreat tomorrow night for the regional school committee. I don't know if this is something where we'd want to, if we're simultaneously setting the goals for this year and perhaps beyond, but also it sounds like potentially setting up a process that we would like to be kind of institutionalized, and I think that would be really useful given that, with the town council coming, we're also moving towards all 5 of us potentially not being here and when the next election for school committee happens. So I think that it would benefit not only us, but it would really benefit future school committees. So, but given the number of things on our plate in terms of all of the stuff we've talked about today, I don't know how to make the time in a meeting. That's kind of one of these meetings for that. I also, know all of us have incredibly busy schedules and families and all of that. So I'm not saying it has to be in a retreat, but I could see this being several hours, or at least several hours over several meetings. Because I also, I don't want to respond to any of the specifics, because I'm also feeling a bit I haven't had the time to reflect. And maybe there's a way for us to do some of that reflection and come back to the group with proposals, like maybe all of us write this memo and do some homework, for lack of a better word, and share it. I mean, it's hard to share this kind of homework publicly. You know, like I usually don't share my homework with all of Amherst, but but I think it would be useful for all of us to either as a group or individually and potentially both have time to reflect on what we want and what we'd like to see, both as the process and then also as the specifics for this year and moving forward.
Dr.
Well,
Morris?
I can defer. I'll
I was going to sort of build on what you were saying, Carrie. I do think, so recognizing that we're all very busy, if we're not meeting again until the end of September, I do feel like to keep this discussion going and have that having an extra meeting that might be devoted just to this. We were very productive, I thought, having those single topic meetings over the summer.
Yeah.
So if, maybe it wouldn't need to even be a full 2 hours if we do your idea of having some homework ahead of time and coming to that meeting prepared and some sort of, and very clear sort of working goals for that sort of ad hoc meeting.
I would strongly urge us to do that, particularly because if we're thinking about, actually, let me back up. I cannot possibly agree more with the suggestion that Spitzer had around coming up with an institutionalizable process that we feel comfortable with, and that like we started to do on the superintendent evaluation, where we do actually have a process. No one says it's perfect, but my God, it's a lot better than we used to have. And even more importantly, there's sort of a repository of how we go about it. That's a guidepost for future school committees. And so if we set that sort of bar for ourselves, where we're not assuming it has to be perfect, but it's more structured, more clear, more transparent than it also just leads us to another 3 to 5 year plan, which we need and we don't have. I think that would be really desirable. And so I think in order to even imagine what we need to do to set ourselves up for success this year and get us to superintendent goals that aren't being approved at the end of November, like we have to meet before the 25th. And we have to try to find a way to make time to do that.
Yeah, so I agree with the train of this conversation. I think the thing I'd say, I'm trying to work on my clarity this year. And I don't mean that I'm being totally transparent. So I think 4 meetings a month is a reasonable expectation. So I think the thing I guess I'd push the chair of the Amherst School Committee is to say, are there months this year in particular, given what's on the plate in Amherst, where 2 of the 4 meetings go to Amherst? Historically, it's been 1 or 2 go to region, and it's not that there aren't things going on at the regional level. I'm not pretending that there aren't, but I think when we get into adding meetings beyond 4 a month that are heavy in content, and I'm not just even talking about staff or myself, like I think collectively, those of you who are on both committees, like I felt like there was a couple times last year where it happened, where it affected the quality of the meeting. The quantity of meetings sort of overwhelmed the quality of the meetings, and I don't want to see that happen. So I think I agree with everything people are saying. I actually think a structured protocol to lead committee through this, and I don't mean that we necessarily have to be an outside someone. I mean, it's something that I'd be happy to meet with the chair and vice chair and think about what protocol might work, but I can think of a futures protocol that might kind of provide everyone the access points to be able to participate in ways they feel good about. But I think that is a structured, long process, and so just thinking about looking at the schedule and thinking about when that could happen before the 25th, I completely agree, makes sense. The Jewish holidays make it a little complicated in September. But I think striking that balance of number of meetings, quality of meetings, is just something that I want to keep in mind for the committee and for staff. And I'm not only speaking for myself, but just having that balance is really important. So
How about
we have
this?
2 consecutive meetings.
For process moving forward, so maybe Dr. Morris and I and Mr. Dumling can get together and think about what that timeline looks like, and then we'll get that back out. And then we will simultaneously, or I will simultaneously, or Debbie will, probably better, get out this draft just as a starting point. And so, you know, and then if there's any suggestions or changes, please send them to me directly, and I can collect that, and then we can have a conversation at our very next meeting about this specific issue, and we can get the ball rolling that way. Does that make sense? Okay.
I'll cough my assent.
Thank you, everyone, for your indulgence with that, and I recognize that it was very unusual to approach this way, but I think hopefully we get to a point where this feels like a better thing.
I'm sorry, I don't want to interrupt, but just to let you know, there's only 40 minutes left on this. I don't know.
Just want to let you know, there's only like 5 more minutes left on this thing, so
It's just over
up a
40
little bit.
minutes left.
You know, it's going to rain.
It's an important note. Thank you very much, actually. Okay, so moving us along. I am failing miserably at my job tonight. Okay, so the next item on the agenda is administrative team licensure update. And with that, I am going to turn that over to Dr. Morris.
This will be quicker than 10 minutes for sure. So when we last left off talking about this, we were exploring what we want our administrative structure at the elementary level to be like. Collectively, the principals and I came to the conclusion that we needed to maintain an assistant principal model. The alternative would have involved, just to put numbers to it, principals taking on over 100 IEP and 504 meetings a year and evaluating over 50, depending on the school, but over 50 staff, which then, if you do the math, ends up being about 200 observations over the course of the year. Those are only things administrators could do. When we looked at the practical reality of it, and we got down to numbers and nuts and bolts, it was not practical to have a model that didn't have assistant principals at the elementary level. So just the update is Renee Greenfield, who was initially hired contingent on licensure as the assistant principal at Fort River, received her licensure, so that went through. The last two, and that was through a full process that happened this spring, involving parents, staff members, and the community. Once we made the decision, Crocker Firm and Wildwood we posted for interim assistant principals. Just given the timing, we felt like we'll get a more robust pool with a more complete search next year, although I'm going to let Doreen at a future meeting talk about and she talked about a little bit the recommendations from the group that she met with around process hiring committee in the spring about what to do with interims. But I'm not going to go down that road at the moment, just to say that we had a thorough process involving community members, families, and staff members. And the recommendation that came to me was Allison Estes for Wildwood and Jennifer Smith for Crocker Farm to fill the one-year interim assistant principal roles. Consistent with DESI's requirement, we verified all the licensure information. We didn't interview anyone who wasn't licensed. We didn't consider anyone, but they asked us to take the extra step of confirming with Brian Devine, who's the head of licensure at DESI. He got back to us within 48 hours just to confirm that our reading of it was correct. And they're going to be in the assistant principal roles for next year. So just to put a finer point on it, all of our administrators are now fully licensed. I'll only speak for the Amherst elementary schools right now because of the meeting, but our 3 principals all have their professional licenses, which last 5 years before needing to be renewed. The assistant principals all have their initial licenses, which are good for 5 years before needing to be advanced to a professional license or renewed. There's some situations where you can, but most of the time it's advancing to a professional license. Our central office was all set, but our team is fully licensed moving forward into the academic year as we promised the community and DESI and confirm with them. So that's my update.
Any questions or comments from Dr. Morris about this?
And thank you for the members of the interview team who spent, again, volunteer time over the summer, interview a lot of people, and come back, thankfully, with unanimous recommendations. It's nice when that happens. Yeah. Doesn't usually.
Thank you. And, you know, just to put a finer point on it, I think, because we haven't really talked about it at the Amherst School Committee level, is just, you know, I've talked with Dr. Morris, and I know other members of the committee have as well, about just trying to get regular updates on licensure and where we are just in status. And so it's really helpful to hear that everyone is, fully licensed at this point and meeting the bare bones requirements, and that we will continue to provide those kinds of updates as new staff are hired. So in the spring, when we make those permanent hire decisions for vice principals and for other positions, that we would be hearing about that on a regular basis. It's just really helpful to know.
Absolutely. And if there wasn't more tape left, I would do 3 minutes on the wonderful people that we just hired in the roles. But given the 40 minutes and the topics, just know that they come highly recommended, and I'm very impressed with our team that we have this year.
Great.
So I'll leave it at that.
Look forward to meeting them.
Yes.
Okay, moving us along. So the next item on the agenda is regionalization update. So Mr. Demling, would you like to update the committee?
Yes, and I will also be succinct. My obligatory standard issue summary of what this is all about is that our region, Amherst Pre-K to 6 elementary region, is considering forming a new region with Pelham's Pre-K to 6 region. We already share Dr. Morris as superintendent, Union 26, as well as curriculum and central office. And so, does this make sense financially, educationally, and for all those reasons to regionalize? So that's what we're doing. We have a planning board, 3 Amherst, 3 Pelham. And we have been meeting every couple weeks throughout the summer, soldiering on. So we're at the process where we're trying to finalize the consultant contracts. So we have a regionalization grant that we received. So so far this is not costing us anything, which is nice. And so we have essentially a finance contract to do a deep dive analysis on the financial particulars, as well as a process kind of structure contract to look at issues of governance and shared policy, enrollment zones, those sorts of things. And we may also engage a consultant to a limited degree for public engagement, though we're still sort of working that out. So that's mostly what we're doing. We're also trying to put together some educational materials, some very high-level summary educational materials, one-page kind of FAQ things that we can share out. One of the challenges and one of the main roles of the board is to just raise public awareness and educate the public on what it is we're studying and what are the advantages, disadvantages, and to get the feedback, get the pulse of the community. And so we're working a lot on that. So we have tentatively we are presenting to the Pelham School Committee on September 4th. And I can confirm this on our last school committee planning item, but to this committee on the 25th, if the agenda is available for that. Ideally we'll be able to send you out some materials beforehand, so that it's not a complete 101 level for this committee, that we'll have some time to sort of go back and forth about any particular items that may be of interest or of question for you. That will also sort of, September is going to be a really big kickoff time for when we want to be engaging the public as much as possible. I think it's going to be pretty challenging for a group of, there are 6 of us, but it's only 6 of us, and to be able to engage all parts of the community, because it's not just the schools, right? It's everybody pays taxes and cares about the future of the schools in our towns, and so we really want to be reaching out everywhere. So we're going to be looking at the school committees and town representatives and community organizations to help spread that word. Just in terms of timeline, I've mentioned this a few times before, but we've talked on the committee that we are moving as expeditiously as possible, but we also want to move as deliberately as possible. So right now we have kind of a high-level schedule where we're getting our consultants finalized now, and they're going to do their work. We'll be doing our community outreach work, engaging with the school committees this fall, and then hopefully this winter-ish, so this winter meaning technically the season of between December 20th and March 20th, that broad of a time frame, we would like to be able to make a decision. Now, it certainly could, a recommendation I should say, the board making a recommendation whether to regionalize or not. We've talked on the board, we could certainly come to a point and say, you know what, there's some issues have come up and we're not comfortable enough to make a recommendation. In that case, we would move forward. The only schedule idea there is that if we go too long next year before making a recommendation, then we're not leaving enough time to craft the detailed regional agreement, which given that it would be a merging of policy from Pelham and Amherst, would be a lot of the time for this committee and for Pelham's committee, and so a lot of work during the summer. We would want that to be finalized in time to be approved by DESE and presented to the public enough for the final vote. So the final vote would be Pelham Town Meeting, and we're 90% sure it's a public vote in Amherst, given the new form of government. We're awaiting confirmation on that from our town council, but so this would be probably November-ish. Not ish, it would be November for a public vote, because it would be that's when the regular vote would happen. And that all has to happen and finalized by the end of next calendar year in order for the district to take effect the following fiscal year, if that makes any sense.
Just to,
Yes.
So is it 2021?
So 2020.
2020, okay.
Right, so FY, okay, so FY 21.
It is a
FY 21,
yeah, yeah.
meaning the first day of the new region would be July 1st,
2020.
2020.
Right.
Kids come into the new region that
next year.
fall, and yes, FY 21, yes, thank you.
Great, thank you.
So that's what we're sort of shooting for that, but if we get to a point where we feel like we don't have enough information to make a recommendation, then we'll push it off. So that's the kind of timeline there. So I'm looking forward to actually sort of getting this thing off the ground and the contracts all settled. We have a really great board, I think, of experience, a lot of diversity of background. So I think that's a big plus. And people who really know both towns too. So, yeah. Any questions there? We'll get into it next meeting. But
Peter, can you just remind us who's on that board? Because I've got the names.
Yeah. So Mary Lou Tileman, she's the current chair of the Finance Committee in Amherst. Joan Temkin, longtime Amherst resident, former Pelham School Committee member, I believe. Tom Fanning, he is a former middle school teacher. Is that correct? Yes, and he does a lot of volunteer work in Pelham.
And he's a part-time employee
Okay.
at Pelham as well.
Yep. Kara Castenson, chair of the Pelham School Committee, also regional school, and Emily Marriott, who you'll know from the regional school committee. No longer on the regional school committee,
Former member.
but very active in town. Yes. So yeah, it's a great, very knowledgeable, experienced group.
Great, thank you very much. Any questions for Mr. Demling? Nope. Great job, thank you. Okay, so with that, moving us along to the next item on the agenda is the feasibility study update, which is actually referring to the Fort River Elementary School feasibility study update. And Mr. Nakajima, could you update us?
Yeah, I will, and then I actually missed the last meeting, so I'm going to defer to Dr. Morris to continue filling in. I gotta tell you, you're all missing a lot of fun. Because I know you didn't volunteer for it, and I just want to know, tough luck. You're missing out on a great group of people. It actually really is. The between the community members, actually of different sorts, it's working, in my opinion, it's working out the way we would have hoped, that there's an interesting balance of community representation and people who have professional backgrounds in project management and architecture and building. And so it makes for just really good conversations between folks who have a deep, everyone there cares about the schools and the quality of the schools, but just the interrelationship between the questions that are being asked and the ability to get an answer not just from the consultants who brought on board, but oftentimes from other members of the committee. Jim McPherson also has been active in it every meeting or nearly every meeting. So we've just gotten, I think it's really just been a good group of folks. We are at a point now where we have a designer that's under contract and has begun doing work. We're going to be, unless we did it last meeting, we're going to be revising our schedule for deliverables because we currently had it, I think our current thing is that we had it, that the deliverables will be done like by the end of the year. And I think realistically it's going to take into next year a little bit, but not terribly. I mean, I'm saying this on my own bias. I'm hoping whatever revised schedule we have approved doesn't push us too far into calendar year 2019. And that, the designers who have a bunch of initials for their name, so I don't actually remember what the initials are. Do you remember?
I can look.
TSKP Studio.
Well done.
TSKP Studio. That's because Tony Cunningham is not only filming these things, but therefore standing and staring and actively listening to all the meetings. So she has this stuff memorized, which is wonderful. And the designers as was mentioned earlier in public comment, have experience on everything from building renovations of open classroom, to new construction of schools of a variety of types, to also new construction of zero energy buildings. And so who would have thought of, right? We actually have a capability or competency where they can bring an experience. This is, I think, probably a little different for them in the sense that normally there's a construction project that's sort of set up at the end of one of these processes. That's obviously not true for them. But the nice thing is they also have experience with setting up a broad range of potential project outcomes or scenarios and modeling them, running to ground issues on them, as well as also doing some level of pricing of them. We're also going to have an independent price estimator as well, cost estimator as well. So I think so that process is underway. Obviously, they have challenges around trying to, all the moving parts we've described are then moving parts for that firm to say, how do you define what program you want, what enrollment you want, or if there's more than one scenario for enrollment, what is that? So it's challenging. Do you have anything on that from the last meeting?
Yeah.
Or just in general?
Just from the last meeting, I think that's a great summary in terms of the where we are. So the three things that stood out to me from the last meeting, one is that we talked a lot about engagement and where the right times for engagement are, that we want to engage with folks, not wait till everything's done, but also give them some sense of what has been, what's the right sweet spot of, we have something to share, because it's not like this open-ended process. We have a volunteer group that's doing, incredible work supporting the architects, and so we thought of multiple points of engagement that would, places where feedback could functionally be used and could be received, so that there wouldn't be nothing's happened, where are we? Because a lot of work's been gone on both in the community, the committee, and that committee, the building committee or the feasibility committee. So we talked a lot about that. They've requested an educational plan be developed. And so what the resolution was, I'd sent the architects at their request their prior educational plan. And their opinion was, yes, no grade reconfiguration, and that part was out. And those of you who were on the committee may remember that, because it had to be approved by the Amherst School Committee. But that a lot of the other pieces were developed in a collaborative process with educators and community members, and we're not in a wildly different place in mathematics instruction or literacy instruction than we were less than 2 years ago, or about 2 years ago. So what they recommended, the committee recommended, is that Tim Sheen actually is going to be co-facilitate with the architects a session to look at the former educational program. What do we X out? What do we say, actually, we need to dig into this, and what needs to be revised, and what do we just keep as is, because it was really good content and good process that came to that. The architects felt like it was in really good shape overall. And they commented on that, so that'll happen in the next 2 weeks, because they really need that to get that going for their next steps. Which leads to the segue to Mr. Nakajima's last point about, well, there's all these scenarios, how many students,
Yes.
right? And so what we've landed on for now is for them to do space summaries for a school of 315 students, which is roughly what Fort River looks like if you play forward the enrollment a couple of years. It's actually a generous estimate of what Fort River looks like. And then 420 students, which would be, let's say we do Fort River has 3 classes per grade level across 7 grade levels. At 20 students in a class, that ends up being 420 students. There's lots of variables that could affect things here or there, but at this point we need to work from 2 scenarios. We can't say, well, if you had preschool, then it's going to be, right, they need to get down to putting things on paper,
And
knowing that they'll always have
for the
adjustment.
money, you can't have 4 scenarios, right? Like you could imagine creating even more scenarios, but then we don't have the time or budget to actually do this.
Right.
Sorry,
Exactly.
just
No,
throw that
no,
out.
absolutely. So right. I think it's an important point that you raised. So this isn't setting that, oh, well, now the Amherst School Committee is directed for Fort River to have either 315 or 420 students at all costs. It's just that they functionally need to start planning what these buildings would look like, and they can't do it on 6 different enrollment schemes. So I think the committee's comfortable. My sense of it, the committee's comfortable with those 2 as being what the architects are going to use as their models. And the architects are clear, as all architects would be, good architects, that you're going to build with some levels of what if it's larger, what if it's a little smaller, and you're thinking through those things, but you need some level of base. So the space summaries were developed, and we're going to give more feedback. There's a lot of concerns, particularly around the specialized programs, what their needs are. So the architects are going to be, back quite frequently to learn more about those programs. But we're moving forward.
Thank you. Mr. Dunley?
Can I just say I really appreciate Mr. Nakajima's positive comments about the group dynamic. We certainly spent a long enough time talking about the composition of what that committee should be, and it's really nice to hear that fruitful discussion paid dividends.
Well, my favorite part about the whole thing is that one of the meetings I missed was highlighted by a member of public as being a particularly spectacular meeting. So I don't know what that says about the whole thing. But it really has been. And actually, what's interesting is that early in the process, because a number of the public community members have project management or architectural backgrounds, people had to find, and other people don't, right? And so they had to find their way to working together where some people can speak at a level of authority around how you do a project like this and how you don't. And other people have their own experiences that they're trying to bring in terms of the values they want in the building. And how you figure out how to work together and do that in a way that feels mutually respectful. It is mutually respectful, but then also gives you an opportunity for mutual learning is a learned skill, I think, by a group. And I think they've done a good job of it.
Okay, thank you very much, both of you, for that. Okay, so the next topic on the agenda is titled Disclosure when Advocating for Child Conflict of Interest Update. And basically, we wanted to make the committee aware of a disclosure that's been on the books for some time, from what I understand, but hasn't been properly discussed with the committee, or a previous one, to my knowledge. So we wanted to bring this to your attention and also make the community aware of it in case it had fallen out of general knowledge. Was that a fair assessment, Dr. Morris?
I mean, to be very candid, so I was talking about this with another one of my colleagues with more experience, and everyone runs into this issue, whether it's in the staff level or the school committee issue, and people seem really unaware that the state has defined a process by which supervisory school officials, when advocating for a child, have a disclosure. So I thought I'd take no more than 5 minutes. And I've been in touch with Mr. Terry about this, and he also said, yeah, that's a good thing for people to be focused on, and he had some thoughts on it. I'm going to just...
Yeah, I think we've maybe got 3 minutes left on our...
We actually have 18.
Yeah.
Oh, good,
Oh,
okay,
oh.
all right. We'll take
You're supposed to
what
say
we need.
8.
I think I can do this briefly and follow up with any individual, because my goal isn't that, people can't talk to me about it. It doesn't apply to everybody, but I think, Ms. Stodonis and I spoke, and I thought it was a good thing to do in a public meeting.
Yeah.
I'm doing the same thing with our administrative team this week during admin week as well. So this isn't a blanket form, right? So it's not that anyone around the table who has a child in the school should just fill it out and say, yep, I'm good. But there are situations that arise where many of us wear multiple hats. We're, school committee members or administrators, but we're also parents in the school district, and there's no literal way. So I heard a good story about someone who literally did a hat thing at a meeting at a child, but that seems hokey and not so official. It's important that public officials are able to advocate for the child. They don't lose their right to advocate for their, anything on behalf of their children, but that there's some format or disclosure that supports them in doing so in appropriate ways. And so with this document, and Mr. Terry's opinion is the form itself is not required by the regulations, but the disclosure is. But I think forms actually give people a place to fill things out, whereas it's like, oh, I should have sent that email. Right? I think I actually like forms in that regard. And so really with this, and the directions are sort of on the back. So the big thing is that if someone who's a parent guardian is a supervisory role related to people they're meeting with as they're advocating for a child, or there's a disagreement in the schools, that they're filling out this form and you're filling out the disclosure, and it's just trying to delineate that they're not using their role as a supervisor to advantage the advocacy process. You can see at the bottom of the actual form for regional school committee members, it's with the clerk or secretary of the committee, which is Ms. Westmoreland. And in my opinion, we would do this kind of similar thing in terms of elected officials in the Amherst School Committee as well, that she'd be the holder of this. And again, it's really just to prevent a situation where there's a mischaracterization of roles, that you're publicly declaring and acknowledging that you have a supervised role and it's not being used to advocate. So I think it's good for everybody, it's good for the public official, it's good for the school, so that there's real clarity on roles, responsibilities, and that people are able to advocate for their child. And just, one of the things that Mr. Terry and I were emailing about is what's the degree of advocacy, right? So it's like, I think my child needs a little more challenge in mathematics. That's not really fitting this. This is if there's a real disagreement about child's education. And so there's no perfect script for exactly what fits that line, because I was looking for one from Mr. Terry. It's like, well, there isn't one. But I think my feeling is there's always safety in disclosing, even if you feel like you might be approaching that line. It's better to disclose and they're like, well, you didn't really need to, than to not be sure. So that's what I'm going to advise my administrative team, and give them Mr. Terry's advice. That's what I advise committee members as well.
Just a quick related question. So, I'm assuming also that this does not apply to a standard parent-teacher conference that takes place, across the schools every year.
No, and so
even though you're meeting one-on-one with the teachers, right? It's still not. So it doesn't rise to the degree of having to disclose that meeting.
Not at all. So it's really if there's, when I talked to Mr. Terry, because we emailed about, but I also spoke to him as well. So he gave me some tangible examples. So a parent's in a meeting and they're disagreeing on a placement for a child, whether it's a special education placement, and a parent guardian who's a supervisory is disagreeing around that. A suspension, there's a student discipline based on a perceived infraction, and a parent guardian disagrees with either that the infraction existed or occurred, or what the consequence is. Another one that was raised is a grade. So child gets a grade on a report card, family wants to advocate that the grade isn't an accurate reflection of what the child's learning and what they showed. Those are really what he was talking about, not, how's your year going? I think my child needs more, maybe social emotional support in this area. I want to right, those kind of things are more routine. I think it's where there's a kind of clear disagreement that's tangible. That's what his recommendation was in terms of the use of the form and the disclosure.
And also thinking about spouses or significant others, right? The co-parent.
Yes.
If you're a partner with someone who happens to also be a supervisor or a school committee member or something like that, and that person's name gets invoked or even implied during that advocacy session, is that something that should be disclosed as well, or is that, it feels like a grayer area at that point, but.
It does. I go back to my general rule of thumb is if there's a gray area, disclosure
Disclose it.
helps, right? Because then there's no ambiguity. Because I think, the counter argument would be, well, even if I'll just use myself as an example because it's better than using someone else. So if my partner or my spouse was advocating on behalf of my child, even if I wasn't present at the meeting, the specter that I'm a legal guardian hangs over the meeting, and my presence doesn't prevent that from being at least their perception, and it's really trying to avoid that. So my advice, based on my conversation with Mr. Terry, is better in that situation to disclose it's better to over-disclose than under-disclose. That could be an awkward phrasing in other situations, but in this situation, yes.
And just one clarification, so this says here, elected school committee member files with the clerk or secretary. Is that what disclosure means, or does that mean also telling the person with whom you're meeting?
It's filing with the
Yeah.
clerk, yeah. I think whether you choose to share that or not is up to you, but you're filing that you're not in this official role, and you've announced that by the clerk.
Got it, thank you.
Any other questions or comments, Mr. Demling?
So for our committee that's not regional, it would be with the city clerk or town clerk?
Yeah, and I asked Mr. Terry that, and I have to put a finer point on my question on that, because I think he answered a lot of my questions around it, but not that one in particular, so I will remind him I will ask him more
The
clearly.
plain reading of the text, if this issue comes up before you get an answer, would, I think, be yes.
Mm-hmm.
That would be my opinion as well.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Morris. I agree that, I think it's important for us, which is what we had talked about when we met, just to at least have the conversation with the school committee and make the public aware. It's not something that I had ever heard in the past couple of years that I've been sitting on the committee. And I'm sure at some point it's buried knowledge somewhere among some previous school committee member. The form itself appears to have been revised last in February 2012, which doesn't mean it doesn't apply anymore, but clearly it hasn't been something that we've been talking about for a while. So it's great to have this, great to have that conversation. And then I guess if anybody has any follow-up questions, we should just refer back to you for Mr. Terry, or.
I'm happy to play a conduit role.
Okay,
Yeah.
great, thank you. Okay, so next item on the agenda is gifts. Do we have any gifts?
Unfortunately not.
No gifts. It might be a little too early still.
Yeah, that's my hope.
Yeah. Okay, so moving on, school committee planning. We have these multiple policies that I appreciate continue to show up on the agenda. At some point, the policy subcommittee will address them, I'm sure, and then make recommendations, but we'll just keep putting those on there. Any other, Dr. Morris, would you want to go through the upcoming agenda items?
So one is the topic that yourself, myself, and the vice chair will talk about, which is kind of a conversation about goals or planning exercise. For the 25th, I have the joint meeting with the Regional Planning, RSDPT.
RSDPB?
Yeah.
Which, by the way, won't technically be a joint meeting. It will be a meeting of the board. Because a quorum of the Regional School District Planning Board will be present, but it won't be published as like a joint meeting, from what I understand.
Okay.
I'll
check on
confirm that.
Yeah.
Okay.
So something like that.
Anyway.
Something like that will happen,
Um,
yes, okay.
I have the East Street School transfer to the town of Amherst, which we talked about and had a brief discussion with the assistant town manager in June, I think. So he's looking to come back to close the loop, hopefully, on that with a little more information.
Great.
Charter school expansion discussion, I heard there was an interest in that. More focus on dual language programming. And the last one was Crocker Farm space needs as a distinct topic. That's what I captured as I was
That's
on
what
my
I
running
thought,
list.
yeah. I think also just discussion about space consideration, Crocker Farm.
Yeah, so
Yeah,
I got
that's,
that.
yeah, that's it,
I
yeah.
said it differently, but that's what I meant.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, anything else from the committee, anything else that,
Just because I think as we move forward with the dual language, we've often also wanted to touch on the school identity. And we did get a lot of details today, and I'm trying to just gauge, you mentioned that we're thinking this would be like a year-long process. I'm wondering if we should either hold off or get regular updates on that as well as we move forward, just so it doesn't.
I think regular makes sense.
Yeah.
I agree with you. I mean, I think with the intensity of leading towards a vote on the dual language, I think earlier in the fall, that's just gonna take more weight because because of the fact that you're voting on something, or being asked to vote on something, excuse me. But I think the regular updates make a lot of sense.
and we've, I think we've discussed enough about the implications for the community writ large about, not having any sense of clarity, or feeling like they don't have clarity maybe, about what's gonna happen at their schools. So I completely agree with that too. Okay, with that, Mr. Nakajima.
No, sorry, I apologize.
No, it's fine.
What I'd love to do, though, is I'd love to then say, if we're just gonna get updates on the Crocker and Wildwood stuff, I'd like to ask you to get back to, you can just get back to Anastasia and Peter about this for planning purposes. Is it realistic to get a deeper dive on that topic in November? I mean, just because I feel like, I don't mean as negatively, because I understand what you're getting at, but I feel like saying we want to have, real tangible identities and directions for Wildwood and Crocker that feel like a meaningful complement to dual language, and setting that as a goal, which I think we've set as an objective. And then toggling from that to the group they're doing is so sort of granular and like really deep, that we can't see anything particularly meaningful about its progress. And I'm teasing you in a way because I'm uncharitably describing what you said earlier. Like, that's not gonna fly after a couple months, right? At some point, and I think particularly at the point we get to, if in October, we take a vote to say, hey, guess what, everyone? There is going to be this shiny new toy at Fort River. Then like the very next meeting, we better come back with, oh, and by the way, here's some substantial progress we've made on Crocker and Wildwood. Does that make any sense?
It does. I mean, and just to be even more clear in my comment earlier, I mean, I actually think I'd love to have 2 Amherst meetings a month for the fall. You know, but I also love not to have more than 4 meetings a month. So that's going to be the rub, because this isn't a regional meeting or a Pelham meeting. But I do think having some alternating meetings where not just me presenting, but actually principals saying, here's the type of things we're working on, right? Be really valuable. I'm not sure in 1 meeting a month how to do that well, and to give you, the committee, and sufficient information that you need on votes that you're being asked to take in. So I think maybe the 3 of us can get together and try to figure out, is there a way to increase, at least temporarily in the fall, the number of Amherst meetings, scale back some other things, and then flip that for winter and spring, or something along those lines. Because I agree with you completely, and I think it'll be greatly unsatisfying if we have one time a month 5-hour meetings, right? Like, I don't think that's the best model either, right? So that's the conundrum as I see it.
Okay. So that makes sense to me as well. And thank you for that. Okay. So I will take a motion.
I move to adjourn.
Second. Anybody?
Second.
I hope that was the motion you're looking for.
Thank you very
I
much.
really jumped right in there.
All those in favor? Okay, thank you very much. Meeting is adjourned.